I'm Wendy Zuckerman, and you're listening to Gimlet Media's Science Versus. This is the show where we pit facts against law and order. Quick warning, we're going to get our hands on some dead bodies in this episode. So if you have some small ears listening or some big ears on a small person, maybe you want to hold off listening to this episode right now or switch to headphones. This is part 2 of our episode on forensic science. In part 1, we looked at areas of forensic science that have been used for decades. These include bite marks, fingerprints, and microscopic hair analysis. So if you haven't heard that one, we recommend that you go back and have a listen. Now, in this episode, we're looking at forensic science that has just started entering the courtroom and putting people behind bars. Forensic science that is pushing the boundaries of what's technologically possible. To explore these new emerging sciences, we're going to dive into 2 high-profile cases that you might have heard of. First, we'll look at the Amanda Knox trial to explore the emerging problems with DNA evidence. And then we'll look at the Casey Anthony trial to investigate cutting-edge science into the smell of death. Yep, you heard me right. The smell of death. When it comes to whodunit, everyone has an opinion, but then there's science. My producer Caitlin Sori and I headed to Texas to meet some researchers that are working at the forefront of forensic science.
Welcome to Texas.
We're in Huntsville, about an hour's drive north of Houston, and dotted in the fields surrounding us are cows as well as 7 prisons, including one that houses inmates on death row. We're driving a little bit away from the main town, heading to a research facility run by Sam Houston State University. It's called a body farm, and it's where donated dead bodies are carefully laid on the ground outside so that scientists can watch as the corpses break down. Caitlin was a little nervous.
It's like we've just driven into a horror film.
Come on.
No, but it is. Like, look at all these, like, cute little houses. There's mist in the air, and we're on a road towards a body farm. It's a bit creepy.
You are absolutely reading into this. This is just a small town.
We're driving to our deaths.
Dead end. We are literally seeing a sign that says dead end. You might want to slow down there.
Yeah. This is a stop. Just driven into a horror film.
The researchers at the body farm study the corpse's smell, skin, hair, nails, and bones. Their findings are then used to help figure out what cops can tell from dead bodies at a crime scene.
So what can we do for you?
The head of this research facility is Dr. Joan Bytheway, and we met her in a room full of bones, carefully put away in little drawers.
Doesn't it smell good?
What is that smell?
Just from the bones, and yeah, that's what it smells like. It's a wonderful space in here.
Joan wore bright pink scrubs. Her glasses chains were sparkling with little beads. Joan was training to become a hairdresser before she completely switched gears, eventually doing a PhD in anthropology and ending up here. Joan took us on a tour of where the bodies are being left to rot. Hayley Dodd and Kevin Durr, who work with her, came along for the ride.
My rule that I always have when I come out here is I always bring gloves. Always, because you never know. You never know.
This facility is surrounded by a high metal fence with razor wire running along the top, kind of like how you see at prisons. The vultures have heard us approaching and cleared off for the moment. Through the gate is a forest of tall trees and some shrubs. Caitlin and I are playing it cool until we spot our first corpse.
So is this person wearing a shirt?
No, that is what the flesh ends up looking like throughout the decomposition process. It looks like they're wearing clothes, but it's actually skin.
Desiccated skin, so it's lost all of its moisture, and it's incredibly tough when it's in that state. Incredibly tough, and that skin can last like that for years. We've counted it out here.
Most of the bodies we're looking at today have been decomposing for at least a couple of months. They are stretched out like starfish. Joan tells us that you could find a lot of evidence on a body like this if it was at a crime scene, including, say, the DNA of a perpetrator.
Let's say that this individual had physically tried to defend herself and she had DNA under her nails. you know, you could potentially, because the nails are very resilient. I mean, they will stay on the hands and feet, and you could potentially use that to collect DNA.
But when you scrape under the fingernails of a victim looking for a perpetrator's DNA, it tends to be only a small amount of DNA to work with. Over the last decade or so, scientists have become much better at analysing that small amount of DNA, which, by the way, is called trace DNA. And it can be found in the handful of cells that you shed when you sweat, cough, or even just touch a doorknob. And trace DNA is the first type of forensic science that we're diving into today. We're asking, how reliable is the evidence that we get from trace DNA? To explore this, let me tell you about what happened on November 2007 in a small, picturesque Italian town. A British student, Meredith Kircher, was found stabbed to death in her house. The alleged murder weapon was found in the kitchen of a young man called Raffaele Sollecito. Raffaele was dating one of Meredith's housemates, Amanda Knox. An Italian investigative team said that trace DNA on the blade of the knife matched the victim, Meredith. And they said that DNA on the handle of the knife matched Amanda. These DNA traces painted quite the picture in people's minds. Amanda Knox holding a knife and plunging it into her housemate. A bloodied bra clasp was also uncovered. It was Meredith's, and the investigators said it had Raffaele's DNA on it. With these key pieces of evidence, the Italian police charged Amanda Knox and Raffaele Sollecito with Meredith's murder. The story had the hallmarks of a juicy one: hot international students, young love, and murder. And the media lapped it up.
American student Amanda Knox is found guilty of killing a fellow student during a drug-fueled sex game
that went horribly wrong.
The girl known as Foxy Knoxy is why Italians are calling this the trial of the decade.
Amanda and Raffaele were found guilty of murder. But then, after spending 4 years in prison, Amanda Knox and Raffaele Sollecito were acquitted, partly based on problems with the DNA evidence. Just last year, Italy's High Court annulled the convictions. So, what went wrong with the DNA evidence? To find that out, we have to start with some Forensic DNA 101. How do you match tiny bits of DNA, trace DNA, found on a knife or a bra, to an individual? Our guide here is Dr. Cherie Hughes-Stam. She works with the bodies at the Body Farm, but we met her at a conference room at the university. So, we came all the way to Texas.
Oh, hello. How you doing? Great. How are you?
Good.
Only to meet another Australian.
Sorry, mate. You're stuck with my Queensland accent.
Cherie is a commissioner for the Texas Forensic Science Commission, which advises the state on misconduct in Texan crime labs. And she told us that when you've got trace DNA evidence, like from a knife blade or under fingernails, you've got to extract DNA from the cells that they've left behind, which means breaking the outside layer of the cell called the lipid membrane.
Cells rupture pretty easily just with some basic chemistry and heating, some detergents so that they can rupture the lipid membranes and out spills all the DNA from the nucleus.
So once you've got the DNA on its own, you can measure these very specific and special markers in it. These are used to make a personalised DNA profile, which kind of ends up looking like a bunch of little peaks lined up on a mini mountain range. Then, this profile is compared to the profile of a known suspect or compared to a database of profiles. And if the profiles look the same, then it's a match. Now, when you have a lot of cells with a lot of DNA, then DNA analysis is really reliable stuff. This has been done for decades on millions of samples in crime labs around the world. A 2014 study of forensic DNA cases in the Netherlands found that mistakes are made in less than 0.5% of the analyses. But Cherie tells us that if there are just a few cells in the sample, like if you've just touched a knife, like in the Amanda Knox case, or perhaps if the sample had been damaged and you've just got those few cells to work with, things can become a lot more complicated.
Because A, there's not enough DNA in the sample to start with, or B, the DNA is there, but it's severely degraded, so you'll get what's called a partial profile.
And a partial profile means that some of those peaks that make up the mini mountain range of DNA are missing. Even if you get a full profile from your trace DNA evidence, you can still have problems. Even if all the peaks are there, problems can emerge because of a second issue. When it comes to DNA analysis, you have to copy the DNA so that you can detect and analyze all the peaks. Now, even if you have a lot of DNA to start with, you still have to copy it. But if you only start with just a small amount of DNA, then you have to do more and more copying. And when you copy it and you're starting with a crappy picture and you're copying it and you're copying it and you're copying it and you're copying it and you're copying it, the picture gets harder and harder to read.
Not only are you amplifying or increasing the signal of the real amount of the DNA that's there, but you're also increasing the noise. You can end up with all of these unexpected things happening. You can run that same sample 3 times and get slightly different results 3 times. And so essentially it makes DNA interpretation a lot more difficult.
You can run a DNA profile and copy so much noise that some peaks might just go missing, or peaks can pop up when they aren't really in the DNA sample. So one way to sort this problem out, says Cherie, is that you can repeat your DNA test several times. And if you keep seeing the same peaks coming up, then you know those peaks are for real. So what does this look like when it plays out in a courtroom? Well, this takes us back to Amanda Knox and Raphael Solicito. To recap, the analyst who looked at this case originally said that the knife, the alleged murder weapon which was found in Raphael's place, had DNA on it. From Meredith Kershaw, the victim, and Amanda Knox, the alleged murderer. But 2 years later, the independent analysts who re-examined the evidence of this case said that they couldn't conclude that Meredith's DNA was on the knife. So how did they get different answers? Well, what was found on that knife were only tiny, tiny bits of DNA. This was trace DNA. And remember what Cherie said about needing to repeat the matching experiment several times when the samples are small so that you can keep seeing the same peaks coming up over and over again? Well, the first analyst in the Amanda Knox case was asked how many times she repeated her test. And she said only once.
But now, an independent analysis of that knife by 2 court-appointed experts has found that the DNA was so minuscule, so scant.
Conclusion. Technology that allows scientists to extract DNA from just a handful of cells opens up a world of possibility for investigators. But it also opens up a world of potential mistakes, and investigators need to be ultra careful when interpreting this kind of evidence. So that's trace DNA. But another DNA issue that came up in the Amanda Knox trial was about the DNA found on the bra clasp.
Kircher's bra clasp, found in the bedroom where she was murdered, had Solicito's DNA on it. According to prosecutors, it was enough to convict them.
The Italian investigators matched some of the DNA found on Meredith's bra clasp to Meredith, which makes perfect sense. It was her bra. But there were more peaks in the DNA profile on the bra clasp than just Meredith's. And these extra peaks, the investigators said, matched Raphael. This type of evidence where there's more than one person's DNA in a sample is called a DNA mixture. And it leads us to our next question. Can you reliably untangle different people's DNA to figure out who's who? So, Cherie says that if there are just 2 people in the DNA mixture and you know one of their DNA profiles, say the victim, then it's all pretty straightforward for scientists to eliminate the known DNA profile from the mix and leave behind that of the suspect. But more than 2 people, and things get messy pretty quickly.
Well, as soon as you get very, very complex mixtures into one sample, that's when you're always going to have the most difficult time generating very clear results.
So, for example, when the Italian investigators first analysed the profile of the DNA mixture on Meredith's bra clasp, They identified peaks that matched Meredith's DNA and Amanda Knox's boyfriend, Raphael. But there were other peaks in that DNA mix as well. The DNA analyst on the case, when asked about these peaks that didn't belong to Meredith or Raphael, said in a preliminary hearing, quote, "From my point of view, they're artifacts," end quote. In other words, she thought the extra peaks weren't from another person, but noise from the copying machine. But 2 years later, when the independent forensic experts re-examined the DNA profile, they disagreed. They thought those extra peaks weren't just noise, but evidence that at least one other person's DNA was on that bra. They called the initial assessment, quote, "not reliable," end quote. Another thing you need to know is that DNA mixtures with tiny samples of DNA are very susceptible to contamination. When forensic investigators turn up on a scene, if they're not careful, they can spread trace DNA through their gloves when they touch doorknobs and knives or other evidence. That bra clasp wasn't found until 46 days after Meredith's body was discovered, and the independent experts wrote that contamination, quote, "cannot be ruled out," end quote. The DNA evidence from the bra clasp and the knife were both thrown out, leaving the prosecution with very little to go on. Amanda and Raphael were acquitted. So analysing DNA mixtures, it's challenging and things can go wrong, which is why it was recently announced that more than 24,000 cases where DNA mixtures were used in Texas would be re-examined to see if there were any problems. Basically, it's believed that Texan analysts had been giving a higher degree of certainty that they were right in some cases, that they could match someone's DNA within a mixture than they should have been. Conclusion. DNA mixtures are hard to interpret when it's just left up to humans. In fact, Cherie told us that in many cases, labs would not even try to interpret a mixture with more than 2 or 3 people. Evidence from a crime scene with that mess of DNA were once considered a dead end until enter complex statistical modelling. A flurry of computer programs have hit the market claiming to untangle mixed DNA profiles with remarkable accuracy. These programs weren't used in the Amanda Knox trial, but since that case, more and more crime labs have started using them. The FBI started using one of these programs at the end of last year. All of these programs have technical sounding names like Armed Expert, True Allele, Lab Retriever, FST, and my personal favourite, Forenzim. One of the biggest programs in the business is StarMix. It was partly developed in New Zealand.
StarMix assists with the rapid interpretation of complex DNA profiles. It does so by combining the most modern of sophisticated models to interpret profiles in just minutes on a user's PC. StarMix. Resolve more DNA mixtures.
What a sick beat, bro! But there are very few independent studies that have looked into how accurate and reliable these computer programs are.
Our accents are completely different. They're like, "Where's the car?" And we're like, "Where's the car?"
As I was saying, there are very few independent studies that look into these programs. Most studies that have tested their validity and reliability have actually been done by the companies who make them. Still, Cherie says that many labs, including hers, do their own tests to make sure that the computer program is spitting out reliable results. And so she trusts them. She says these programs are a helpful tool for her.
I can say that I would be much more comfortable going on the stand, being able to give a statistical weighting from one of these products that we now use. Yeah, I'd feel more comfortable going on the stand with that in my back pocket.
A comprehensive report from the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology concluded that even though we don't have many independent studies here, from what we do know, these programs are better than human judgment and could produce reliable results, but only, quote, under limited circumstances, end quote. Like when only 3 people's DNA are in the mixture. They said there is relatively little published evidence when it comes to untangling cases where there are more than 3 people in the DNA mix. More work needs to be done. Here's Cherie.
will still say that there are limitations where this should not be used to interpret so many person mixtures. But so yeah, it doesn't solve all your problems. It's not the magic bullet to fix everything.
Conclusion. When scientists are analysing DNA, the accuracy depends on how many people are in the sample. With one person, it's easy. If there are two people in the DNA mixture, scientists can still usually tease them apart. But if there's DNA from 3 or more people on, say, a bra clasp, things can get really difficult. And while computing programs are trying to help, without independent testing, it's not clear how reliable they are. When I asked Cherie about where this DNA evidence is all heading, she described it as a kind of arms race between what police want, what the public expects, and what scientists can provide.
So what happens is people find out, oh, we can get DNA from a doorknob. So then all of a sudden the police now starts, swabbing every single doorknob that they can see. And then, of course, now we've got lots of DNA, right? And we've got all these different people, but there's small amounts. So then what we do is say, okay, well, now we've got such small amounts of DNA, but we can't really see that well. So now we've made our kits more sensitive. Oh, yes, now we can pick up these really, really low amounts of DNA. Oh, but now with increasing the sensitivity, now we've got more background contamination coming through. Now we have to, and so now that creates another problem. It goes round and round. As we want to do more, we're able to do more, but then that generates other problems that we then have to tackle.
Oh, technology. It makes things better, only to create new problems. After the break, we sniff out another forensic tool that's pushing the boundaries of science. This episode is brought to you by FedEx. FedEx delivers more than just packages. They're working toward delivering a more sustainable future. This initiative is called Priority Earth, and the goal is to reach carbon neutral operations by 2040. FedEx says they're also starting to modernise its fleet by adding zero-emission electric vehicles and creating more recyclable packaging. Priority Earth is the most important delivery FedEx is making yet, because it's an address we all share, Earth. FedEx, where now meets next. To learn more, visit fedex.com/sustainability. Welcome back to Science Versus. Okay, so we've solved the case of Amanda Knox. You're welcome. Now let's sleuth another incredibly high-profile court case, the Casey Anthony trial. This trial partly hinged on the ability to smell death. For everyone outside of North America, or if you were just listening to Firework on repeat for the entirety of 2011, as you shoot across the sky. The Casey Anthony trial was one of the biggest courtroom dramas in America this decade. Time magazine called it the social media trial of the century, and it all focused around a young mother accused of killing her 2-year-old child.
Some very troubling questions today in that Florida courtroom where Casey Anthony sits on trial, accused of killing her own little girl, Kaylee.
2-year-old Kaylee was missing for a month before it was reported to the police. By the time Kaylee's body was found near the family home, they'd been searching for her for 5 months. And Casey, the mother, was the main suspect in the death of her daughter. The case against Casey Anthony wasn't strong. There was no slam-dunk physical evidence to pin the crime on Casey. And so the prosecutors brought in some evidence at the edge of science, including the alleged scent of a decomposing body in the trunk of Casey's car.
The smell of death, that is the gruesome topic this morning as court gets back in session in the Casey Anthony murder trial.
The smell was first picked up by K9 Garris, a German shepherd trained to detect the scent of a dead human. The dog was taken so seriously that it was put on the stand. No, the dog's handler, the sheriff's deputy Jason Forgy, was put on the stand. He said that Garris was shown around Casey Anthony's car, and when the dog approached the trunk, he did exactly what he was trained to do when he smelled human remains.
Garris comes out of the trunk with his front paws, comes out of the trunk to the right rear passenger taillight bumper area, and gives me a final trained alert. He goes into a down position.
The final trained alert. to indicate that the trunk had a dead body inside. Now, there was only one problem. When they opened up Casey's car trunk, there was no dead body inside. Kaylee's body was found 5 months later, but the police said the dog's signal was evidence that Kaylee's body had once been in the trunk, alleging that Casey had put her dead body there. So, what is going on here? And can a dog really figure out where a dead body once was? Starting at the beginning, when bodies decompose, they smell. And the fact that bodies smell tells you that chemicals are being released into the air that then lock onto our noses. When we die, bacteria and fungi start infesting our bodies, triggering a whole range of chemical processes that fart out molecules into the atmosphere. And these are called volatile organic compounds. So for example, when bacteria eat carbohydrates in our body, they can turn them into alcohols. And as muscle and fat tissue degrades, they can turn into other types of chemicals. Now, humans can't smell a lot of these compounds, and particularly we can't smell them from very far away. But there's a superior species when it comes to smelling. Chickens. No, dogs. Dogs. And they've been used to find dead bodies in clandestine graves for decades. To find out how a dog like Canine Garris in the Casey Anthony trial was able to smell death in the boot of a car, I met another dog trained to find dead bodies. Zap.
It's good panter. Strong pant going on.
Zap is a black Labrador mutt, and Matt Young, his handler, says he's trained Zap to only search for the scent of human dead bodies. So not dead pigs or dead chickens or a home-cooked meal.
Right, like my game with Zap is he's looking for dead people. He doesn't care if they're new dead people or old dead people or girl dead people or boy dead people. The dead people is dead people, and he goes and finds them.
We met Zap and Matt at one of their training sessions in a scrubby wooded area in a park about an hour's drive from the body farm in Huntsville. The fireflies were out and the moon was starting to rise, and Matt had hidden some human placenta in the long grass around the park.
Ready to work?
Zap had to find it.
Zap, busca.
Yes, he said busca. Zap speaks Spanish so that Matt doesn't accidentally give him commands when he's talking. So Matt releases Zap and he runs straight for the patch of grass and starts barking. Matt digs into the grass and voila, the human placenta wrapped in plastic is revealed.
Good dog. Oh, good dog.
Now Zap doesn't care if he's solving crimes or finding human remains. He's really only after one thing. A squeaky toy. To train Zap to zoom in on human remains, Matt also hides animal decoys like dead pigs in the park. Now, if Zap barks when he goes to the pigs but not the human remains, he doesn't get his toy. Zap is so well trained that at one time he even smelled out a body that had been dead and buried for 18 years. But there's not a lot of research when it comes to how reliable these dogs are. A 2012 paper found that the scientific literature on the capability of dogs trained to find human remains was, quote, sparse, end quote. Still, it's pretty easy to tell if a dog can find a body because the dog barks and voila, the body is there. But using dogs the way Canine Garris was used in the Casey Anthony trial to find where a body maybe once was, that's something harder to track. For one, handlers can affect what their dogs do. Researchers have found that when the handlers think they know where a target is, it can influence their dog's behaviour. It's something that Matt is keenly aware of. He has to be very careful with his body language because the slightest movement can give the game away. Like, if Matt knows where the placenta is, and then with his body language accidentally gives away what he wants Zap to do.
Like you're now just standing there leering at your dog, and your dog's like, oh, yeah, this is totally it.
Which means the dog isn't necessarily smelling death, it's just reading its handler. Now, this issue came up in the Casey Anthony trial because the defence argued that the dog handler might have given Canine Garris some indication to do his gesture at the trunk of the car. Now, since the police didn't videotape the search, the jury had no way of knowing what body language he was using and whether he did accidentally influence the behaviour of the dog. And the thing is, we can't ask the dogs. Did you smell a dead body? Why did you do what you just did?
Zap, doing an interview.
So when Zap indicates that he's found a dead body, he barks. But he's a dog. He barks at other stuff too.
So what is he barking at now? Does he ever...
Barking at that other dog. He's super jealous.
Can you tell the difference between a I'm jealous bark and a I found a dead body bark?
No, I can't. I'm sure there is a difference, but to me, he's just a loud dog making a lot of noise.
Now, whilst there isn't a lot of research in this area of dogs generally, there actually are a handful of studies on whether dogs could sniff out where a body used to be. And these studies do suggest that dogs might have this superpower. So in 2007, researchers in Hamburg placed 2 dead bodies on a carpet for a few minutes, and then they cut out the carpet and placed samples in glass jars. They then mixed those jars with other jars that were full of clean carpet. They repeated the study in different ways and found that 3 highly trained dogs were able to pick out the corpsey smell in the contaminated carpet over 90% of the time. And another study, published last year, found that around 86% of the time, dogs could pick out the smell of soil where a corpse had been up to 667 days after the body was removed. Now that is impressive. But still, it does mean the dogs were getting it wrong around 1 in 10 times. And ultimately, if there's no body to confirm that the dog is right, how do you know? Here's Matt again.
Unless you actually are physically recovering anything from any case, you don't actually know technically if your dog was right or wrong. If somebody dumped a body in a location for just on the ground for 3 days and then came back, picked it up and moved it, there's not going to be any evidence that we could readily find. And so all you really are left with is law enforcement looking at you and your dog barking at nothing, going, well, these people are useless.
But of course, in the Casey Anthony trial, the cops didn't say that Garris was useless. He was used as a key piece of evidence. Conclusion. Dogs are pretty remarkable at finding human bodies and could potentially find where a dead body once was. But when there is no physical evidence in front of you, we can't be sure what the dog is trying to communicate. Which is why prosecutors brought in a human person in the Casey Anthony trial to back up what Canine Garris, the dog person, had signalled. An expert witness had never been allowed into a United States court to say that they could detect the smell of a decomposing body until, that is, Dr. Arpad Vass was called in as the smell of death expert to testify at the trial in 2011. Here he is on the stand describing his initial reaction when he smelt the air from the back of the trunk.
Well, first I jumped back about 2 feet because the odor was pretty strong, but it was, to me, the smell of human decomposition.
Arpad has been studying the chemicals that make up the human smell of death for years. He worked at America's first body farm at the University of Tennessee and is one of the pioneers in this research field. That's why he was contacted during the Casey Anthony investigation. He was sent sections of the carpet lining of the trunk, and when he opened the evidence cans,
there was a horrible odor coming from that. It was very characteristic, in my opinion, of human decomposition.
He said it reminded him of something very specific.
If you have a potato that's, in full rot, the potato is turning black and is squishy and fluids are draining from it. If you have a potato in that stage of decomposition, I think the odor, at least to my nose, is very similar to that of a human decompositional event.
And so how did you know that it wasn't just a rotten potato?
Well, one, there were no potatoes in the car, and two, chemically looking, what my nose can sense versus what the instrument tells me is there is completely different.
The instrument. Arpad analysed the air emanating from the trunk liner using established techniques like gas chromatography, which pumps gas through a column to separate out chemicals so then they can be identified. So Arpad looked at the array of chemicals that were coming out of the trunk liner and thought, it's a match.
Well, there was about an 80% match of what we considered should have been there based on the age of the child or the decedent.
That is, Arpad said that he identified a scent that was 80% similar to that of a decomposing body of a child. But the thing is, the trunk wasn't empty. It had a lot of junk in it. No potatoes, but there was other stuff that really smelled.
And there was, dirty diapers in there. There were empty pizza boxes, gas cans. I mean, it was a huge plethora of material in the trunk of that car.
So Arpad had to analyze each of these things separately. He had to get empty pizza boxes and diapers and other gas cans and analyze all of those chemicals and separate them out and then see whether they could have been responsible for the smell in the trunk. At one point, it was even suggested that the smell could have come from a squirrel that the car had once hit.
So we actually looked at a squirrel as well. We found a squirrel that had been hit on the road by a vehicle, and we allowed that to decompose on a similar piece of carpeting as to what was in the trunk of the vehicle.
And he says that none of those things, the diaper, pizza, gas can, emitted a chemical profile that looked like the smell of human death.
The profile was completely dissimilar to what we saw in human remains.
Now, central to Arpad's testimony and research is that he knows the suite of chemicals that are uniquely emitted from a dead human body.
Well, there are about 500 different chemicals that emanate from a decompositional event. We've narrowed it down to about 60 that are important. And there are a number of different chemicals that are specific to human decompositional events, which we use as markers.
But here's the thing. Most other scientists will tell you that we don't know for sure which chemicals are specific to human decomposition events, because a lot of chemicals found in human dead bodies show up in other animals. Part of the problem is that we don't know exactly what mechanisms are farting out these particular odors, like exactly which bacteria is breaking down which cells in order to produce which chemicals. We know the basics, that decomposing protein, carbohydrates, and fats smell. But pigs, squirrels, cows, and humans, we're all made of that stuff. So it's not too surprising that we emanate similar chemicals when we die. And for this reason, researchers in this field are yet to find a consistent set of special chemicals emitted from human corpses and not other animals. In 2012, Arpad wrote in a paper that he had found 4 chemicals that, quote, appear to be human-specific, end quote. But then, 3 years later, Belgian researchers found that 3 of those 4 chemicals that were human-specific were found in other animals too. Now, those researchers did say that they identified a bunch of chemicals that were just in the decomposing humans in their experiment, a unique cocktail. But they pointed out that in order for that to be taken as fact, more work would need to be done. They wrote in their paper that this was a, quote, first step, end quote. That is, the results of the paper would need to be replicated. So, the research on the smell of death is still clearly unfolding. Yet, 4 years ago, Arpad went on the stand in the Casey Anthony trial, and he said that he knew the markers that he had found were definitely the smell of human death. I asked him about that.
Wouldn't you feel more comfortable with your science to know that someone else had replicated it? Isn't that sort of the purpose of good science, that you have it replicated by different teams?
Who am I to say that one group needs to go and replicate my work? That's up to them. I have no problem doing it.
But more for the confidence in your own work, so that you feel confident enough to be able to go to court and say, this is the scientific consensus. Look at these teams that have replicated the work.
But if no one's willing to do that, what am I supposed to do about it?
Well, potentially not feel so confident about your work when you go into court.
No, that's not the right answer.
What is the right answer?
The right answer is to be confident in your work, and if someone wants to replicate it, go for it. Go ahead, replicate it.
Other scientists criticised Arpad's work during the Casey Anthony trial. They said he came out of the gate too early with this one. Dr. Donovan Haynes is a chemist at Sam Houston State University, and he also studies the chemicals that get emitted when animals die. Donovan remembers the scientific community's reaction to Arpad Vass's research being used on the stand.
In that Vass case, if you look, there's a lot of discussion among forensic scientists about should it have been allowed in court at all, and that's them erring on the side of saying the bar's pretty high here before we put something in front of a jury that's going to potentially convict somebody, to make sure that that science really is good vetted science in that case.
Why do you think that some in the forensic science community and some scientists were not happy with the testimony and with the research you presented in court?
That's an interesting question. I really don't know the answer to that. Some of it possibly is jealousy. Some of it could be perhaps they've been working on it and couldn't come up with a suite of chemicals. I honestly don't know the answer to that.
The jury in the Casey Anthony trial deliberated for 10 hours and 40 minutes before giving a verdict.
State of Florida versus Casey Marie Anthony. As to the charge of first-degree murder, we, the jury, find the defendant not guilty, so say we all, dated at Orlando, Orange County, Florida.
Conclusion. Using chemical analysis to detect where a dead body has been is in its very early stages of research. Currently, the studies are inconsistent, and there is not a reliable suite of chemicals that can be measured from decomposing human bodies. So when it comes to science versus emerging forensic sciences, do they stack up? When you have a single sample with a lot of DNA in it, the evidence here is solid. DNA analysis works and can reliably pin a perp to a crime. But when there is only a little bit of DNA evidence in your sample, only a few cells, the results can get less reliable. As you try to copy the DNA, noise gets in the analysis and it's harder to interpret. Another problem, when there's several people's DNA in one mixture, things get really complicated. One new solution is to use computer programs to untangle the mess. Now, these programs show a lot of promise, but right now we don't have much independent research into their reliability. As for the smell of death, dogs have been used for a long time to lead search parties to corpses in unmarked graves. Trouble hits when the dogs are used to find where bodies used to be. Because dogs don't talk, we can never 100% know what they're really trying to say. What's that? Nah, I know you might be able to do it. It's just that... Oh, just take the toy. As for people knowing the smell of death, the science here is inconsistent and we need more work. So, the big question now, why is experimental science entering the courtroom and being presented as scientific fact? Here's what Arpad had to say about it.
I mean, if the court's willing to accept my expertise and my testimony, that's up to the court to decide. It's not up to me to decide. I do the research, I present the results. If the court wants to say it's acceptable for the legal system, then that's the court's problem, not mine.
Arpad says this because there are hearings before a trial begins where judges decide if science is valid enough to be presented in the courts. The problem is, of course, that judges and lawyers often don't have any scientific training. Deciding what is a valid science often involves lawyers just throwing their experts at judges. This is hardly a peer-reviewed process. So if we're not going to throw out this system, then we'll need forensic scientists, as well as cops and lawyers, to step up. When it comes to the science, Dr. Joan Bytheway from the Body Farm, she says she knows there have been problems with her field, but she said she's also worked with a lot of good forensic scientists who are just working hard to solve cases. And ultimately, she's hopeful about where this field is headed.
My perspective over the years of teaching this for 20 years and working with law enforcement for 20 years in this, have there ever been mistakes in a courtroom? Absolutely. Absolutely. It's not by the fault of deception. It's just by the fault of we're growing, we're learning, every day we're trying to become better at what we're doing. And that is the goal of all forensic scientists. And if it isn't, they are ferreted out. Eventually, they are ferreted out.
And there are calls for more ferreting to be done. In an editorial published in an academic journal last year, which read more like a call to arms, forensic scientists at the University of Dundee wrote, quote, "We must be both bold and brave about exposing and recognising baseless junk science and cowboy practitioners," end quote. And exposing those cowboys is important, because when science is admitted into the courts before it's rigorously tested, people might be wrongly convicted, victims can be misled, and guilty people can walk free. That's science versus forensic science. This episode has been produced by Diane Wu, Shruti Ravindran, and Heather Rogers. Our senior producer is Caitlin Sori. Edited by Annie Rose Strasser and Caitlin Kenny. Fact-checking by Michelle Harris. And a big thanks to Joseph Lavelle Wilson, Will Doolan, and Beth McMullen. Thank you for helping us out. Sound design and music production by Matthew Boll, mixed by Martin Peralta and Matthew Boll. Music written by Bobby Lord and Martin Peralta. Next week is our final episode for this season, and we're tackling antidepressants. Do they work any better than a dummy pill?
Frog sperm and feathers and fur and spiders that were given as treatments that people would ingest, and if it didn't kill them, it might make them better. And that's part of the history of the placebo effect.
I'm Wendy Zuckerman. Back to you next time.
Choose your own offline listening adventure. Spotify Premium lets you download and take your music on the go. Try 3 free months of Premium now and cancel anytime. Tap the banner to learn more.
Hey, it's Bill Simmons from The Ringer, and this is a podcast called The Rewatchables. We have been doing it really since 2017. It started with how much we love the movie Heat. We decided to structure a whole podcast with categories: most rewatchable scene, who won the movie, Apex Mountain, what aged the best. But here's the thing. If you want the full archive, you can hear them only on Spotify, for free, by the way. So make sure to follow The Rewatchables on Spotify.
Hi, I'm Wendy Zuckerman, and you're listening to Gimlet Media's Science Versus. This is the show where we pit facts against pharmaceuticals. Today we're tackling one of the biggest mental health questions of the decade. Do antidepressants really work? Now, if you're feeling depressed or you just want to talk to someone, in the US, you can call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255. That number will be on our website along with other resources.
Currently, I'm on trazodone.
Prozac, venlafaxine,
Wellbutrin, citalopram,
bupropion,
Lexapro.
We are well and truly living in the age of antidepressants. More than 1 in every 10 Americans over the age of 12 take antidepressant medication. That's according to the Centers for Disease Control. And over the last 2 decades, the number of Americans on the meds has jumped nearly 400%. But it's not just Americans who are popping these pills. Globally, the number of people on antidepressants has increased over the decade. Since the late 1980s, these pills have been considered a major breakthrough in the treatment of depression. But in 2008, a study came out that cracked the industry wide open. It said that antidepressants work about as well as a sugar pill, and because of that, there is little reason to give these pills to most people suffering from depression. Headlines came out screaming, "Antidepressants don't work," and a media frenzy began.
For the millions of patients struggling with depression, putting their faith in medications to feel better, this won't come as happy news.
The fight is about antidepressants. The medical community is at war.
And the war rages on today, with academics continuing to pump out papers and books with titles like "Ordinarily Well, the Case for Antidepressants," And then those on the other side calling antidepressants the emperor's new drugs. Meanwhile, patients are left in the middle, not knowing whether they should take the drugs or not. So, today we are going to wade through the studies and the counter-studies to find out, do the drugs work? When it comes to antidepressants, there are lots of prescriptions. But then, there's science. Before we get into the debate about the drugs, let's talk about depression. The National Institutes of Mental Health describes it as a serious mood disorder that lasts for 2 weeks or more. But serious mood disorder can manifest in many, many different ways. So to give you a tiny sense of what it feels like to have depression, we spoke to a group of people that are willing to spill their guts out to a microphone. New Yorkers.
The way that I often describe depression is it's not really an emotional thing, it's more of a lack of emotion.
Suicide didn't even make sense because there was no pleasure in the darkness either. It was just zero.
I had a really short temper, I was really impatient, and that's not typical.
I was having difficulty sleeping, eating. I had like outbursts of random crying.
I couldn't see the future being better than the present was.
Oh my God, that's like the worst feeling ever. Do I want to die? Do I not want to die? Like, it is very hard.
Depression can feel like an attack on the inside. The people we spoke to said that something small could set off a cascade of internal abuse that hijacks the entire day or even the entire week. It's an intense experience that can hold you prisoner, they said. So, could a pill really be the key to escaping that internal prison? There are several different types of antidepressants on the market, and many of them boost levels of particular chemicals in your brain that are known to help regulate your mood. Now, some drugs, for example, will pump up levels of serotonin, while newer drugs give your brain access to more serotonin as well as another chemical called norepinephrine. On the website of one of the country's best-selling antidepressants, it says, quote, experts believe that depression results when certain chemicals in the brain are out of balance, end quote. So, an injection of these certain missing chemicals should be making people happy. But what if the chemicals in these drugs aren't actually doing anything? There's an intriguing body of research that suggests the power of these drugs doesn't come from any chemical inside the medication, but rather from the power of placebo. The idea of placebo is basically that your thoughts can change your biology. So with depression, you could be taking a pill that is actually just a sugar pill, but if you believe it's the real medicine, then you'll feel better, just because you expect to. And the placebo effect can change how we respond to all kinds of things, from pain relief to hypnosis to the treatment of irritable bowel syndrome. And it's this thing that Irving Kirsch, a psychologist and researcher, has devoted his career to. And he's the one that did that study in 2008 on antidepressants, the study that sparked this whole debate over whether these drugs work or not.
My name is Irving Kirsch. I'm the Associate Director of the program in placebo studies at the Harvard Medical School. And my favorite color is, believe it or not, black. Maybe I like black and red, the anarchist colors.
Interesting for a man who's trying to tear down the way that we treat people with depression. Now, Irving has studied the placebo effect in all sorts of things. But in the 1990s, he started to get curious about the placebo effect in people with depression, because he thought that depression would be exactly the kind of condition that would have a big placebo effect.
One reason for that is that a core feature of depression is hopelessness, a sense of hopelessness. One of the things they're hopeless about is ever getting better. And so now there's a new kind of drug coming out that hasn't been tested yet. It's being tested in this new clinical trial. Maybe that will work. That's something that might instill a sense of hope.
Irving went about studying antidepressants by getting clinical trial data from the Food and Drug Administration. These are the guys that approve whether drugs are allowed to be on the market. Because the thing is that the placebo effect is such a powerful effect that to get a drug approved by the FDA, drug companies have to consider it in their trials. Typically, what drug companies will do is they'll get a group of people, they'll give them a particular drug that they're testing, and then they'll get another group of people and they'll put them on a placebo. Then the company pretty much has to show that the drug worked better than the placebo. But here's the thing. Drug companies don't have to publish all of their studies, so they can pick and choose what they release to make their drugs look better than perhaps they are. Now, this is currently changing, but at the time that all of the antidepressants on the market were approved, that was the system. So, Irving did some detective work, got all of the data, the published and the unpublished stuff. And what did he find?
The surprising thing that we found was that the people got better when they were taking the drug, but they also got better when they were taking the placebo. And the difference between the response to the placebo and the response to the active drug was much smaller than one would expect from a treatment that had been heralded as constituting a revolution in the treatment of depression.
To him, this discovery was a real breakthrough, something that could change the way that depressed people are treated. But many of his colleagues didn't feel that way.
The reaction was of many people, well, this can't be true. Of course, antidepressants work.
Then came even more research suggesting that Irving was onto something. Around the same time as Irving's 2008 paper came out, scientists were discovering that the claim that the drug companies were making about people with depression needing to boost certain chemicals in their brain wasn't right. In fact, it turned out that people with depression weren't necessarily low on certain chemicals and didn't need them to be topped up. Now, there are other theories about how these drugs work, but the truth is, we still don't know what these drugs are doing. So could it really be all placebo? Irving published more and more papers in 2012, 2014, and 2015, all finding that antidepressants really aren't that much better than a dummy pill. But doctors keep writing prescriptions for antidepressants. Irving says it's because they too are being fooled by the placebo effect. And he says there is a rich history of mistaking placebo for effective medicine.
And that's why for so many centuries, bloodletting was thought to be an effective treatment. You have to go back and you'll see the kinds of treatments that they used to use successfully in the history of medicine. It included things like frog sperm and feathers and fur and spiders that were given as treatments that people would ingest, and if it didn't kill them, it might make them better. And that's part of the history of the placebo effect. And
how did they get the frog sperm?
I have no idea. Good question.
Now, to be fair, the psychiatrists that we spoke to said, yeah, we get it. We know that not everyone who is depressed should be given these pills. And lots of psychiatrists, in fact, won't prescribe drugs for some of their depressed patients. The National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, a leading health agency in the UK, specifically says that people with mild depression usually shouldn't be offered antidepressants. They suggest other things, like therapy. But Irving and his research are taking this debate one step further and saying that antidepressants are essentially frog sperm and that no one, not even those who are suicidal, should be on the meds.
Not even the very most depressed patients, no one shows that much difference between drug and placebo, not even close.
Irving doesn't see patients anymore, but at the time his research started coming out, he did. And he was so confident in his findings that he changed the way he treated his patients.
When I started seeing the data, I stopped referring clients that I was seeing for antidepressant medication.
So, even if he's right and antidepressants are all placebo, who cares? What's the problem with giving people sugar pills if it'll make them feel better, if they can get out of bed and go to work? Who cares what's doing that? Just give the people their frog sperm. Well, not so fast, says Irving. There's something else to consider here. The frogs. No, there's actually something else to consider here. Lots of something else's. These drugs have many side effects.
I started to realize that I was becoming zombietized.
It's like really sleepy all the time, and yeah, I lost weight.
I gained a lot of weight at one point.
Like I was like 3 steps behind my actual body.
I had loss of sex drive and I gained some weight.
At the beginning, I had a shockingly low libido.
It affects you sexually.
Stuff down there does not work when you're on it.
A 2014 analysis of a bunch of studies found that on average, around 30 to 50% of adults treated with antidepressants had some kind of sexual problem from taking their meds. There are also rare but noted side effects like having heart problems or being at an increased risk of gastrointestinal bleeding. And Irving says that this list is even longer. He points out that drug companies don't always publish their side effects. A 2014 study backed that up. It looked at more than 100 trials of antidepressants and antipsychotics and compared the numbers of side effects in the published and unpublished documents. On average, the drug companies left out more than 40% of the side effects from their published studies. Bottom line, Irving says that the risks of antidepressants are just too high, and the benefit is just too small.
Continuing to tout antidepressants as a first-line treatment, given data that placebos work almost as well, and that antidepressants have the greatest risks in terms of side effects and health risks, to tout that as the first-line treatment is irresponsible and doing harm to depressed people.
But while Irving may be confident in his work, it is by no means scientific consensus. There are a lot of doctors and researchers out there who disagree with him strongly.
But I want to talk a little about what he just told you, because I think the case for antidepressant as placebo is a house built of fantasy bricks.
Dr. Peter Kramer is one of the loudest critics of Irving's work. That was him at a debate with Irving earlier this year. Peter is a psychiatrist and professor emeritus at Brown University. He's written books on the benefits of antidepressants. And to give you a sense of how much Irving and Peter disagree on the importance of antidepressants, Peter's first book was called Listening to Prozac. You might have heard of it. And Irving wrote a paper soon afterwards called Listening to Prozac, but Hearing Placebo. Yikes. Peter has been treating patients with depression since the late 1970s, and he remembers the world before antidepressant drugs were widely prescribed.
You saw people who were seriously depressed at a level you just don't see that often today. There were people who looked like a Dürer etching or a Blue Period Picasso painting. I mean, thin, racked with pain, wringing their hands, repeating depressive phrases. And in those days, it was treated with psychotherapy.
Peter believes that the age of antidepressants that we're living in today isn't driven by powerful placebo, but rather by doctors like him, seeing how powerful these drugs really are.
You know, you give these medicines to people, they start feeling substantially better within weeks. I think when doctors saw how well these medicines worked, often they were impressed and adopted them wholeheartedly.
And the thing is that Peter relies on a raft of studies to back up his belief that antidepressants are better than dummy pills. Studies like a 2008 analysis of 74 clinical trials looking at the published and unpublished data and found that the drugs were, quote, shown to be superior to placebo, end quote.
Well, there's just a host of evidence that antidepressants do outperform placebo. And, I think the debunking case is just bad science.
So, what is going on here? And how can everyone have their own studies to back up the exact opposite conclusion? Especially when, get this, they are all using clinical trial data that they got from the FDA. How can they get the exact opposite answer? Is it magic? No. Madness? No. It's because of this.
Hamilton.
We'll explain after the break. This episode is brought to you by FedEx. FedEx delivers more than just packages. They're working toward delivering a more sustainable future. This initiative is called Priority Earth, and the goal is to reach carbon neutral operations by 2040. FedEx says they're also starting to modernise its fleet by adding zero-emission electric vehicles and creating more recyclable packaging. Priority Earth is the most important delivery FedEx is making yet, because it's an address we all share, Earth. FedEx, where now meets next. To learn more, visit fedex.com/sustainability. Welcome back. We've just introduced you to two professors with very, very different ideas about antidepressants. They both have studies to back up the claims that they are right. What magic are they using to get their results? No magic, except for the magic of statistics. It all has to do with the tool that you use to crunch the numbers and see whether a drug works. So children, snuggle up and let me tell you a tale of how depression drugs get on the market and how scientists use the same data to make their own arguments. It all starts when you measure how sick someone is. You have to do this in a clinical trial, so then you can see whether someone improves or not after they've taken a pill or after they've popped a placebo. Now, while doctors can check your blood pressure for hypertension or do a test to see if you've had an infection, researchers are yet to find an objective test for depression. So, to figure out if someone has improved after taking antidepressants, they have to ask all these questions about how you're feeling, and then they tally up the points, and then they use those results to rank their patient's symptoms on a scale to see just how depressed they were before and after taking the drugs. And there are a few different scales that you can use for depression, but one of the most popular is called the
Hamilton
scale. Yes, the
Hamilton
scale. And it's been used for more than 50 years. This survey includes questions like, do you think that life is not worth living? And if you do, you get 1 point on the scale. But here's another question on the same scale. Do you have heavy feelings in your abdomen? Like, are you feeling constipated? If you do, you get 1 point. Have you lost your appetite? Do you feel like people have let you down? Do you get gassy? Do you have mild headaches? Do you feel restless at night? If you do, for each one, you get 1 point on the scale. Those with the higher points have the more severe depression. Lower scores mean milder depression. Now, in a drug trial, researchers will take the patient's scores at the beginning and end of a trial, looking to see what's changed. And they'll be specifically looking for the difference between how people's scores changed if they were put on the placebo and how people's scores changed if they were put on the drugs. The goal here is for researchers to see if there is a significant difference between the effects of placebo and the effects of the drugs. And this is important because it's where Irving, Dr. Placebo, and where Peter, Dr. Prozac, diverge.
I didn't want to be Dr. Prozac.
Okay. So it's here where Dr. Placebo and I'm not Dr. Prozac diverge. You see, like we said before, it's all about how you crunch the numbers. There's statistical significance, which is what Peter points to help make his case that antidepressants work. It's been the gold standard of measuring drug effectiveness for decades. For all drugs, not just antidepressants. And statistical significance measures whether the results of your clinical trial were not due to random chance. That is, they weren't just a fluke. But there is also something called clinical significance, which is a higher bar to jump. And this is what Irving, Dr. Placebo, uses. And this is a test that's supposed to more accurately reflect the patient experience. That is, whether the patients feel like the drug is actually working. So when Irving says,
even with the most severely depressed, you don't get a meaningful difference.
What he really means is this.
There's a statistically significant difference between drug and placebo, but it's not a clinically meaningful difference.
So, statistical significance. This is what we will call the low bar, because it's simply asking whether the difference found between the placebo and the drug was not due to random chance. And clinical significance, that's the high bar. Do people feel better on the drugs? So this is what the debate is all about, and it's why it's such a hot media topic, because it's all about statistics. So, now that we're all together on this one, low bar, high bar, let me tell you a little bit more about the high bar. The high bar was determined by a leading public health body in the UK, and it requires that people taking the antidepressants improve by at least 3 points on the Hamilton scale compared to those on placebo. It's worth pointing out that Irving is not alone in wanting to use the high bar. Even beyond depression research, in many areas of medicine, there has been a long push to use higher benchmarks than statistical significance. Now, in theory, it's a great idea to use a high bar to judge a drug's effectiveness, right? To show that the changes you see are going to be important to the patient. But there are real questions about whether the scale used to set this bar, the Hamilton scale, can actually do that. Remember those questions on the Hamilton scale where saying you have a heavy abdomen will get you the same amount of points as feeling like life is not worth living? Or to Peter, that's just wrong and misleading, and it can make placebos look more effective in clinical trials than they really are.
People in the placebo arm of the trial, may do better in terms of their constipation or sleep without really doing better in their core depression.
Plus, antidepressants can actually increase your score on the scale because they have side effects that actually cause sleep disruption and headaches, making someone's depression on the Hamilton scale look worse, even while the drugs actually might be helping their depression. And Peter isn't the only one that has a problem with Irving's high bar. A 2008 paper called it, quote, downright arbitrary, end quote. And on that, here's another thing you have to know about Dr. Placebo, Irving. His studies actually find that people with extremely severe depression do jump his high bar on the drugs. But get this, that 3-point difference between drug and placebo needed to clear the high bar, that's not good enough for him anymore.
Now we have found out that even that would be an overly liberal and overly lenient criterion, and you would need a 7-point change in order for somebody to be rated by their clinician as minimally improved. Now that should someone, if you're getting any benefit, it should at least be minimal improvement.
But while Irving keeps moving the bar, the arguments from antidepressant proponents also run into trouble. Because if the scale is broken and we can't properly measure depression, then a lot of clinical trials that show that the drugs work, the ones that rely on that low bar, they're wrong too. Because here's the thing, they also use the Hamilton scale. Hamilton! And there are other scales that you can use that focus on things like whether you can hold down a job, or they try to look at your overall quality of life. But the thing is, these scales don't consistently show that the drugs are that much better than placebo either. All that's to say, we don't know how to accurately measure whether someone's depression is getting better. And that's not all we don't know. Like we said in the first half of the show, we don't know exactly what these drugs do in the brain. Plus, a lot of this debate about placebo versus antidepressants is based off short-term studies. Many antidepressant clinical trials only go for 6 or 8 weeks, so we don't have much research on what these drugs are doing in the long term, or what placebo does in the long term. And another thing we don't know, how depression works in the brain. Helen Mayberg is a professor of neurology and psychiatry at Emory University. She studies brain scans of highly depressed people. And she thinks about all the unknowns in quite a beautiful way.
It's like an orchestra. Within a brain area, all the violins have to play together. They have to be synchronized properly with the bassoon and the basses and the flutes. We can come up with all kinds of clever metaphors about brain choreography. But at the end of the day, what is a system that emotional pain can lock you down to not even get away? No one knows. So the issue is, it's a mystery.
Given all of these mysteries and unknowns here, Helen says a drug that clears the low bar, statistical significance, might actually be important. It might just be enough of a lift for some people.
How can anyone judge statistically what's a meaningful clinical change? It's like if you're trying to get up the side of a mountain and the placebo gets you part of the way, but it's that extra kick that gets you over the ledge from the active drug. One doesn't want to discount that needed extra boost. And I think that until we really have a way to quantify what that extra part is, I'll still take getting over the ledge if I need the extra help to get there.
Still though, the fact that this whole debate is about a little lift kind of tells you that on average, the drugs aren't that great.
The problem is that our drugs aren't as good as we want, which doesn't mean that they're worthless.
And this was something that we heard from a few doctors. Gregory Simon is a clinical psychiatrist and chair of the Scientific Advisory Board of the Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance. Whew, what a title.
I don't think anyone, or at least anyone who practices much or pays much attention, would say that the current generation of antidepressant drugs is remarkably effective or terribly successful.
His clinical work has given him a chance to see these drugs work in practice. And he says that, it's been a bit of a bummer.
They're actually quite disappointing. They are modestly effective, highly variable in their effects from person to person, and lots of them have side effects. And that's not a very good situation. I would certainly, in my clinical practice, I make do with what I have. So I certainly prescribe those medicines, and I've seen them help a lot of people. But would I wish for something better? Absolutely.
That high variability that Gregory is talking about might be explained by the fact that different people respond to antidepressant drugs in different ways. The results from drug trials are an average, so people who might be responding really well versus people that might be responding really poorly just get washed out in the mix. Helen Mayberg, who talked about the orchestra in people's minds, is researching these different responses. Her work using brain scans is showing that there does seem to be different types of brains that need different types of treatment.
We will learn along the way that when we start to get people the treatment that matches their brain type, then we'll be able to see that if you get drug and you should have gotten drug, do you stay well? Because that is the treatment needed.
And even though this is a live research question, who should get the drugs? Helen says it's an important part of the equation.
I don't think that anyone can deny that there is a placebo response with antidepressants. The question becomes is that because there is an effect above the placebo, is that difference worth it at the individual patient?
Helen, who regularly sees people with severe depression as part of her research, says that because you don't know how different brains are going to react, it's worth giving the drugs the benefit of the doubt. And Gregory, who treats patients with depression, agrees. Irving, though, he doesn't see patients anymore.
Your studies and your words are very strong about antidepressants not being effective. And then when you imagine someone with a patient right in front of them and there's nothing that's working and they're suicidal.
Then you might reach be tempted certainly to reach for anything. I don't know what I would do at this point. I'm glad I'm not in that position. One's heart goes out to the suffering. And it's hard when you when you haven't found anything else, to not look for something that might work.
So when it comes to science versus antidepressants, do they stack up? Do the drugs work better than a placebo? Well, it depends. If you use the most scientifically accepted standard, statistical significance, then yes, they do. But if you raise the bar to try to see a clinical significance, then for the most part, they don't. But there are problems with this higher bar because the way that we measure depression is kind of crude and it doesn't take in all the nuances of the disease. Either way you count it though, and this is important, for people with very severe depression, the drugs help more than placebo. But given the unknowns here, Dr. Helen Mayberg and other doctors that we spoke to do hope that patients will try to get all of the treatment that they can.
If you can get better on placebo, that's great, because that means your brain has a capacity to repair itself. But if someone does take a sugar pill and continues to do badly, I would certainly hope that the fear of side effects wouldn't stop people from actually entertaining the idea that an actual antidepressant medication or other treatment might be in their best interest.
The thing is, when it comes to depression, sometimes you need to try a few things to find out what works. Because at the moment, the science isn't good enough to say whether the pills will or won't work for you. For now, though, what we can say is there is no evidence that frog sperm is useful. That's science versus antidepressants. And by the way, this is our last episode of the season, but don't worry, we'll be back in the spring of 2017, in the US that is. We'll also be occasionally sending out interesting little tidbits, so keep your ears open. And hang around after the ads to hear some of our favourite moments that didn't make it into this season of Science Versus. Sometimes you need to kill your darlings. Not you guys. We love you guys. This episode has been produced by Heather Rogers, Diane Wu, and Shruti Ravindran. Our senior producer is Caitlin Sorey. Edited by Annie Rose Strasser and Caitlin Kenny. Fact-checking by Michelle Harris. A big thanks to Carly Schwartz for sharing her story with us, and to all the New Yorkers who were happy to share their very personal stories with a complete stranger holding a microphone. That's why we love New York. Sound design and music production by Matthew Boll, mixed by Martin Peralta and Bobby Lord. Music written by Martin Peralta and Bobby Lord. You can always keep in touch on Twitter. We're at Science Versus, that's Science VS, or on Facebook. Yes, we are on the Faces. We are also doing our very first live show in Toronto for the Hot Docs Podcast Festival on November the 19th. So go to Toronto, have a visit. Toronto. Sorry, I meant Toronto. You don't pronounce the T. Learning. Thanks to everyone who helped get our new season of Science Versus off the ground. The engineering team at Gimlet, Alex Bloomberg, Caitlin Kenny, Austin Mitchell, Annie Rose Strasser. A big thanks to Leopold Rogers and the whole Rogers clan and the Ludwig family, the Sorey fam, Joseph Lavelle Wilson, and all the Zuckerman family, the original Science Versus fact checkers. We couldn't have done it without you. I was aiming for the target. Yes!
People can come at you with a bat. They can come at you with a tomahawk, with a car, with a pointy stick.
Tomahawk was your second one?
Yeah, I just happened to buy one tonight.
No bug spray.
The guy's like, you go to Sam Houston? I'm like, no, I'm a journalist. I'm going to look at dead bodies. We need bug spray. And he's like, oh.
They fling themselves out of the maggot mass. Like, they'll go flying, like, ping, and then, yeah, like popcorn. Yeah, they're pinging out.
The idea that a kind of Hollywood-style thrusting into the vagina was going to give you sexual pleasure, and that harder thrusting was going to give you more.
Ay, mami, tiene tan curvas y yo soy sin freno. Like, you've got so many curves and I don't have any brakes on my car. It's a cute one.
A little farther away.
What is your name?
My name is Heather. What's your name?
Leo.
You are becoming more and more convinced that Joe is in love with you.
And just in case, can you just tell people they're not in love with Joe?
You're not in love with Joe. You don't even know who Joe is.
It just so happens my boyfriend's name is Joe.
You're in love with Joe. You're in love with Joe.
I'm Wendy Zuckerman. Fact you next time. Hi, it's Wendy Zuckerman from Gimlet Media's Science Versus. And while we've been away, we've been working on some cracking stories.
I'm about 20 meters from the wall.
Like, what are immigrants doing to America?
I kicked the wall.
We did come to the consensus there is a negative effect of immigration.
To get to the bottom of some big questions, we rope in our colleagues.
You want to do it?
No, but for science, sure.
And put our bodies on the line. We test the limits of the paranormal.
See, the portal kind of cuts through the floor, goes all the way through.
We pop some pimples with an internet celebrity.
This is science, man. You see? We don't mess around.
And bite into some very controversial science.
These potatoes that I see in the future will blow the doors off of the ones that we're currently growing.
Oh, what a season. We've read the studies, we've done our homework, and now it's time for facts. There is no alternative. Science Versus will be back in your ears on March 9th. Tell your friends. Tell your Uncle Gary.
I'm just curious, with your podcast, how does all this work?
Grab their phone from them and subscribe them to Science Versus. That's Science VS.
All right, it's just a radio show. Yeah. Okay. I'll have to do more of that then.
Back to you next time on March 9th.
Oh, and look at the school of fishes.
The dolphins went right by them. They must not be hungry.
Maybe they felt bad interrupting them while they were at school.
I can't touch that.
I'm Wendy Zuckerman. You're listening to Science Versus from Gimlet Media.
Okay, what I'm looking at, is that the wall? I think that's the wall. Yeah, it's a bloody big fence. Restricted area. No trespass. I'm about 20 meters from the wall. I can't even why am I so nervous? Because I'm in a restricted area, that's why I'm nervous. Okay, here it is. This is the wall. This is what it's about. This is the border between America and Mexico. I kicked the wall, just so you could hear it. The wall says made in the USA.
I'm at the border between the US and Mexico, about an hour's drive away from San Diego. And despite what you might hear in the news, and as you just heard, on this part of the border, there's already a wall. It's about 20 feet tall and is made of big metal posts and strong wire mesh. Within minutes of kicking it, Border Patrol arrived in a white SUV.
Oh. Hello, how are you?
Good, thank you.
I was just looking for the Friendship Monument.
Not allowed to actually come up to this fence, really.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
A fence?
Yeah, get away from that fucking fence.
I guess it's more of a wince. And a recent Pew survey found that about 40% of Americans want a longer wince, one that runs the full length of the border with Mexico. The goal is to stop immigrants from crossing the border. Yes, immigration. We've been hearing about it a lot recently. President Donald Trump has raised many concerns over the last few months about the problems that he believes immigrants are causing America. At first, he was focused on undocumented immigrants, but now he's shifted to a wider group of foreigners. President Trump has signed executive orders that call for thousands more immigration enforcement agents and expands the pool of immigrants prioritised for deportation.
And all sorts of concerns about immigrants have been dominating cable news.
You know what? I don't get it.
Illegal alien
People want to say, no, they're stealing our jobs, stealing our jobs.
American-born children of illegal aliens.
And no one wants to fucking
You're
work.
going to pay, I'm going to pay.
Social welfare type of policies and programs.
Fucking lazy
Families
motherfuckers.
who have lost people to violent illegal alien felons.
No, stealing our
So on today's
jobs,
show,
stealing our
we're moving
jobs.
away from the border and into the facts. Because when it comes to immigrants, there's lots of opinions. But then there's science. Science versus Immigration is coming up right after the break. This episode is brought to you by FedEx. FedEx delivers more than just packages. They're working toward delivering a more sustainable future. This initiative is called Priority Earth, and the goal is to reach carbon neutral operations by 2040. FedEx says they're also starting to modernize its fleet by adding zero-emission electric vehicles and creating more recyclable packaging. Priority Earth is the most important delivery FedEx is making yet, because it's an address we all share, Earth. FedEx, where now meets next. To learn more, visit fedex.com/sustainability.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. Don't wait for great talent to find you. Find them first with Indeed. It's the hiring platform where you can do everything in one place. And it has powerful hiring tools to help find qualified candidates quickly, like Instant Matching. It can help find candidates the moment you sponsor a job. Join the more than 3 million businesses already using Indeed. Start hiring now with the $75 job credit at Indeed.com/science. Tap the banner to learn more. Offer good for a limited time.
This episode is brought to you by delicious Bear Snacks. Between cryotherapy, goat yoga, and smoothies made with things you can't even pronounce, wellness can feel a bit complicated. But there's a simpler way to wellness. Bear Snacks. They're a tasty, crunchy snack made simply of apples. With Bear Snacks, less is more. Buy Bear Snacks now at most grocery retailers nationwide.
Welcome back to Science Versus, the show where we pit facts against foreigners. There are over 40 million people living in the US today who were born in other countries. Some came here legally, some didn't. But in total, they make up more than 1 in 8 people in the US population. So, what are all these people doing to the American economy and the crime rate? On today's show, we're going to dig into some of the statements that we've been hearing about immigrants. 1. Are immigrants taking American jobs? 2. Are immigrants driving down wages? 3. By getting a free education and other services, are immigrants taking more from the government than they give? And 4. We're going to find out if immigrants drive up the crime rate. And just a quick note, before you go thinking that because of this accent I must love immigrants, here's a psych out. I'm actually a US citizen. That's right, I was born in California. The accent is fake. No, the accent's actually real, but I was born here, raised in Australia. Funnily enough though, being born in the US is enough to class me as an American. Not only to Border Patrol, thankfully, but also to scientists who research immigration. So, we're going to use that definition on today's show. You're born here, you're American. That means when we say immigrant, we're talking about anyone who was born in another country and then came here. So that includes if you've been here for 2 years or 20 years. And a lot of talk in America is about undocumented versus documented immigrants. Unfortunately, much of the research doesn't make that distinction. So we'll tell you when we're talking about documented or undocumented. Otherwise, we're just talking about all immigrants. Okay, on with the show. So, if you want to find out, using science, how immigrants affect a nation or a state or a town, one way you can do that is to look at places that got rid of a whole lot of immigrants, and you can see what happened.
Beginning in 2010, a bunch of US states started passing laws that made life hard for immigrants. The goal? To get undocumented people to pick up and leave. One of the strictest laws came from Alabama, and it was named Adios, Bad Hombres. No, of course it wasn't. It was called the Alabama Taxpayer and Citizen Protection Act. And when it came into effect, police were required to verify people's immigration status during routine stops. Schools needed to find out the immigration status of children and their parents, and Americans were prohibited from hiring, renting housing to, and even giving rides to undocumented immigrants. Since the law was passed, it has been weakened quite a bit by the courts, but still, it was strong enough to scare off quite a lot of immigrants. Now, nobody has collected specific data on how many people in total left the state after the law was passed. But estimates using census data and the Pew Research Centre suggest that perhaps some 15,000 immigrants left. Another estimate out of the University of Alabama pegged the number at above 40,000. Let's be conservative and say thousands of immigrants left the state. Speaking of conservative, some politicians were excited about all of these people leaving. Here's Scott Beeson, who was then an Alabama state senator, speaking at a rally not long after the law was passed.
It is doing what it is supposed to do. It is putting Alabamians back to work. It is putting Alabamians first, which is the way it should be. And it is saving taxpayers untold dollars.
But is it? What really happens when an economy is stripped of its outsiders, when thousands of immigrants pack up and leave? Do Americans get their jobs back? We're heading to Alabama to find out.
Welcome to Birmingham. Local time here is about 12:47 Central Time.
From Birmingham Airport, I drove to the tiny agricultural town of Cullman with our producer Heather Rogers. We saw tractors, horses, and some cows.
What did you do? Something? Did you provoke the cows?
I didn't. They were provoking each other. It was like the best interview I've ever done.
We were heading to meet farmer Jeremy Calvert, who for years has employed mostly immigrants on his fruit and veggie farm. Jeremy's crops grow in the rolling hills just outside of Cullman. His family has farmed here for 6 generations, and he loves it.
There's no smell like a load of strawberries. When the weather's been dry and the berries are producing good, but the only way I know that anybody can experience that is they got to be right there at that right exact moment, because you can't bottle it up and sell it.
Jeremy's got 30 acres, and in summer, when his peach trees are heavy with fruit, he sweats over growing the perfect peach.
Nobody wants a little peach. They all have to be big and pretty, you know. Well, that means every limb on every tree has to be gone over, and it takes time and it takes hands to do it.
To get those hands, Jeremy pays $10 an hour for workers, and for at least the last decade, he's mostly hired workers from Mexico and Central America. But after Alabama's immigration law was passed, he says those workers, who he calls Spanish, became harder to find.
We noticed over a period of months and maybe a year or so, you just don't see as many Spanish folks as you once did.
And to Jeremy, the promise from politicians that losing immigrants would open up jobs for Americans didn't really pan out. He didn't get American workers in their place, and without the help, Jeremy had to pick up the slack, often working 18-hour days.
When you own the operation and the job doesn't get done, the burden falls on one person, and that's me.
Now, studies haven't been done in Alabama to see the effect of the law on farmers, but a survey done in Georgia, which is right next door, found that after a very similar law was passed, farms only had about 60% of the workers that they needed. And this is the sort of thing that Sam Addy, an economist at the University of Alabama, has been studying for years.
Those jobs and what they pay, most unemployed people in the U.S. will not take those jobs.
Now, you might have noticed, Sam has an accent.
Then yes, I am from a small country in West Africa called Ghana.
But Sam has lived in Alabama for nearly 20 years, and he was one of the economists who warned the state when Alabama's immigration law was passed that there might be a negative impact on farmers like Jeremy.
Immigrants typically go for the jobs that we shun. So the only way you can have people fill those jobs is to bring them in. Bring the immigrants in.
Sam points to a study from a few states over
That's
in
exactly
North
my
Carolina
point.
that found that in 2011, in the wake of the recession, there were almost half
Americans
a
are
million
lazy,
unemployed
point blank,
North
I'll admit it.
Carolinians. But when farmers advertised for more than 6,000 job openings, only 7 American workers took those jobs and finished out the season. Yes, 7. And the rest of the jobs? They were filled by immigrants. So, why aren't Americans running for this work?
Laziness.
Well, Jeremy says that he actually used to have a lot of American workers, what he calls
Entitlement,
white
fuck, the list
workers,
goes
on his
on and
farm.
on.
That is until the late 90s.
We could still get your average white person then. You move forward to the 2000s, and that's just not there anymore.
And the data bears some of this out. In 1990, immigrants made up just 7.5% of men working on farms. By 2012, that number had more than tripled. But it's not entirely clear why these days Americans don't want to work on farms. Sam from the University of Alabama says that it's
not
partly
just
because
farms.
Americans have become more educated. More and more Americans are finishing high school and going to college. So now, for the most part, they want to get better jobs and they don't want to work on farms. Jeremy hears this kind of thing around Cullman.
Americans typically don't like agriculture. They view it as a lowly position.
And it's not only that farm work is seen as a step down, it's that the physical labour is really tough. We heard this from researchers as well as farmers like Jeremy. He's had high school football players give it a go, and they struggled.
The ones that did make it would come back and tell me this is the hardest thing I've ever done. To run and work out on a football field in the heat of the day is one thing, but to bend your back and pick squash or pick tomatoes all day long in the rain and the heat and the cold, that's a different matter.
What did they say?
They said, I believe if I can do this, I can do anything.
And then they said, and I can't do this.
Well, we have had some that would stick with us, some because that we knew their parents too well and they were ashamed to quit.
Unfortunately for farmers like Jeremy, there just aren't enough embarrassed high school football players or other Americans to keep all of Alabama's farms running smoothly. A final reason why Americans might not be picking up the slack, according to research, is because immigrants are more willing to relocate for work, while Americans perhaps aren't so keen to uproot themselves and their families for, say, a job in a rural town. We tried to talk to immigrant farm workers while we were in Alabama, but no one would go on tape. They were all skittish, and they said that because of the Alabama law, they didn't want to draw attention to themselves. Conclusion. For a bunch of reasons, Americans aren't taking certain jobs, like farming. And here, immigrants fill the gaps. In those situations, immigrants are not stealing American jobs. But not all Americans are getting more educated. And the ones who aren't, they still need jobs. So, what happens when less educated Americans compete with immigrants for the same jobs? For this question, we spoke to Jenny Hunt, an economics professor at Rutgers University in New Jersey, and she too has an accent.
So how many passports do you have?
I have 3 passports. I have Australian, which is the one I originally had, and then I became American before I went to Canada, then I became Canadian.
Jenny helped write a major report in 2016 by the National Academy of Sciences on the economic effects of immigrants. It's over 500 pages long, very comprehensive. And it found that, sometimes when immigrants compete with Americans for work, immigrants get those jobs. But other times, they don't. And FYI, Jenny calls Americans native born.
There'll be winners and losers amongst the native born.
Because when people are vying for the same job, when there's competition, it can lower wages. But not all Americans are competing with immigrants. It's all based on the skills and education of the people who are coming to America.
Immigrants tend to be either very highly educated or very poorly educated, much more so than the natives. For example, if you're a native-born high school graduate, you're actually not competing that much with immigrants. There actually aren't that many immigrants with exactly high school.
So, high school dropouts compete with high school dropouts, and people with PhDs compete with each other. You can think about it like this. When a prince comes to America, he's not competing with a McDonald's worker. Well, except for in coming to America.
I have recently been placed in charge of garbage. Do you have any that requires disposal?
And while highly educated Americans can compete with immigrants for jobs, most research shows that people who didn't finish high school are the ones that feel the biggest brunt from immigrants. They're the biggest losers when it comes to immigration.
We did come to the consensus also in the report that there is a negative effect of immigration on very unskilled groups of native-born workers.
And Jenny says while this can be tough for people losing money each week,
it is useful to remember that only 10% of natives are high school dropouts these days, and that's shrinking all the time.
In fact, she rechecked the numbers and found that it's actually only 8% of America's population. So it's small, but it's not nothing. It is more people than live in the entire state of New York. But, and this is really important, how much pay do these people actually lose? Because there are reports in the news that some immigrants are having a devastating impact on the wages of some Americans. Are they? Well, this all depends on how you slice up the data, because you've really got to do some careful analysis here. Economists have to separate the effect of immigration from other changes in the market, and so the studies vary. They've found that immigrants can drive down wages by 9% to 4% to 3%, all the way down to 0.7%. Put it all together, and the National Academy of Sciences report says that the impact of immigration on the wages of Americans overall, in the long run, is quote-unquote very small. And here's the thing, even with that 8% of high school dropouts, Americans still aren't necessarily losing jobs. Because while there might be more competition, and yes, an immigrant may be hired over an American, those high school dropouts, that 8%, they can actually find new work. I asked Jenny about this. I said, so, say you meet someone
and they're saying these immigrants coming in, taking our jobs. What would you tell them?
Well, so I'd have good news and bad news to tell them. One is that they probably would still be employed because, again, in the US, there's really no evidence. Nobody thinks employment rate is lowered by immigrants. And so in the pub, he would probably be telling me about his new job. The bad news is that his new job wouldn't be a very good job. And if he was a high school dropout, his wages may indeed have fallen.
Okay, so this raises the obvious question. If there are more people and more competition, why aren't more Americans out of a job? Well, there's something else that immigrants do when they come to a country. They create jobs. Here's how it works. When new people come to the US, they buy food, gasoline, clothes, they rent apartments, they get haircuts, just like in that immigration documentary with Eddie Murphy.
Tell me how you want me to cut this. Just to make it nice and neat.
And all that spending creates jobs for people who work in those businesses where immigrants spend their money.
That'll be $8.
And because of this, back in Alabama, when thousands of undocumented immigrants left, Sam Addy from the University of Alabama was worried.
The biggest thing that stared me in the face was the fact that, holy smokes, don't we realize that for every single one of them who leaves, we have less people buying stuff at our grocery stores?
And this is true of any immigrant, documented or not.
Yes, they are illegal, but their demand is real.
And he says that demand, all that spending, all those new people who want stuff, doesn't just create jobs in restaurants and barbershops, but it actually creates a cascade of new jobs.
Doctors need patients. But guess what? There has to be pharmacies on the side, roads to the pharmacies. So now we need civil engineers and builders and draftsmen and architects. So you can keep going on and on.
And when do we get to the point where we need economists?
You need them all along the line. Let me make a point.
And how do we know this? Back in 1980, this idea that growing demand creates jobs was put to the ultimate test. Around 120,000 immigrants fled Cuba on boats and landed in Florida over 6 months, most of them headed to Miami. And this event is known as the Mariel Boat Lift. It's named after a Cuban harbour, Mariel, where the immigrants boarded on the boats that then lifted them out of Cuba.
Between midnight and noon today, 23 boats reached Key West, Florida.
So what happened to the employment rate of Americans in Miami when tens of thousands of immigrants landed there? Well, there was, quote, virtually no effect, end quote. That's according to one analysis of the boat lift, and other academic papers have found the same thing. This is because the economy of Miami expanded to give these people work, and all of this new demand created more jobs for immigrants as well as Americans. In other words, there isn't just a fixed number of jobs. The more people there are, the more demand there is, the more jobs there are. And this idea is so well established that when our producer, Heather Rogers, spoke to Sam about it, this is what he had to say.
What do you say to people who think that there are a finite number of jobs?
I tell them it's hogwash. But so long as population is increasing or decreasing, there's no finite number of jobs because you're changing demand all the time.
And this demand doesn't just create jobs, it also fills government purses because they get more money in sales and property taxes. Sam says that by icing out undocumented workers, his state ultimately lost out. Since the law was passed, the population has grown at a much slower rate, he says, than it otherwise would have. And to Sam, this slower population growth means less people in Alabama to buy stuff and less taxes for the state.
I think we shot ourselves in the foot, and so we haven't been able to grow as much as we could have.
So how do you know that gap in the growth, how do you know that that's because of the law?
Because there is no other economic factor to explain that slow growth.
And there is a particular group of immigrants, the most highly educated immigrants, that create jobs by doing more than just buying stuff. They innovate. And the way that economists track innovation is by keeping tabs on the number of TED Talks that immigrants do. Because economists and everyone else agrees that TED Talks are the #1 measure of innovation. Not really. TEDx Bendigo, are you kidding me? Seriously though, to track innovation, Jenny Hunt at Rutgers University looks at patents. And skilled immigrants get proportionally more of them than Americans. And these are inventions that companies actually go on to use, which according to Jenny, juices the economy across the board.
But the benefit is spread over everyone, including the low-skilled native-born workers. And we actually think that innovation not only raises wages, but it actually raises growth.
The National Academy of Sciences report went so far as to say that the United States prospect for long-term economic growth, quote, would be considerably dimmed without the contributions of high-skilled immigrants, end quote. Conclusion. For some people, particularly high school dropouts, immigrants can lower your wages. Still, they're not going to run you out of a job because they help to create new jobs. Okay, so immigrants give by helping the economy to grow and doing jobs that Americans don't want to do. But how much do they take? And do they drive up the crime rate? That's coming up after the break. This episode is brought to you by FedEx. FedEx delivers more than just packages. They're working toward delivering a more sustainable future. This initiative is called Priority Earth, and the goal is to reach carbon neutral operations by 2040. FedEx says they're also starting to modernize its fleet by adding zero-emission electric vehicles and creating more recyclable packaging. Priority Earth is the most important delivery FedEx is making yet, because it's an address we all share, Earth. FedEx, where now meets next. To learn more, visit fedex.com/sustainability.
Hello, I'm Mallory Rubin.
And I'm
Van Lathan.
Check out the Ringerverse podcast from The Ringer for all things superhero movies, nerd culture, and fandom entertainment.
We have instant reviews and fun takes on all the latest news and more. Available now on Spotify.
All right, so we've just learned that immigrants give to the economy and tend to do the jobs that Americans don't want to do. But immigrants, they also take. The biggest beneficiaries of immigration are the immigrants themselves. Coming to America lets them tap into resources like jobs that can help lift them out of poverty. They can also get public education, Medicaid, food assistance, and subsidised housing. According to that National Academy of Sciences report, the one that was 500 pages, documented immigrant households are more likely to be getting some type of welfare than American households. And that could be why some 40% of Americans view immigrants as a drain on social services. Plus, immigrants tend to have more kids than Americans, and those kids can all go to public schools and get a free education. Add all these things up, and immigrants are more expensive than Americans on average. Just focusing on documented immigrants for a second, while they do pay taxes, overall, they still cost money. The government spends around $5,000 per year on each immigrant, including their kids. And this equation looks even worse when you include undocumented immigrants, those who don't pay income tax. Now, some undocumented workers actually do pay tax because they use other people's social security numbers, but many don't. But once again, it's all about how you slice up the numbers. When economists figure out how much immigrants cost when they're documented or undocumented, they often charge immigrants for the cost of educating their kids. And Sam Addy at the University of Alabama says this can be misleading.
When you're looking at the education and you start attributing all the education costs only to the parent, it's a flawed analysis. The reason for that is education has spillovers to everybody.
He gave us an example. Say someone, let's call her Wendy Druckerman, goes to school, gets an education, and then starts working. She brings skills to that job that maybe her co-workers don't have. Say Sam's one of her co-workers.
I benefit from it right away because I see how she does her work and I learn how to do my work that way.
Or perhaps she uses her education to go to college.
You know, she's gone to learn and she's making big bucks. Guess what? She can tip the waiter better. The waiter gets a better quality of life.
Or if Wendy Druckerman is a cheapskate, she doesn't tip waiters. She still pays more tax. In fact, that hefty National Academy of Sciences report found that while immigrants might take, the American-born children of immigrants contribute more in federal, state, and local taxes than Americans who have been here for multiple generations. These children of immigrants straight up just earn more money, and so they pay more taxes than other Americans.
Their bottom line analysis is that immigration is good for the country. That is their bottom line. When you read it, you will see it very clearly.
Yes, when the National Academy of Sciences report added it all up, that immigrants compete with some workers, help out other workers, lower some wages, boost other wages, ultimately they found that, quote, immigration has an overall positive impact on long-run economic growth in the United States, end quote. Conclusion. Overall, immigrants do take, and they take a lot. But some of what they take is for their kids. And over time, those kiddos boost the American economy and pay a whole lot of taxes. Final question. Immigrants might, on average, boost the US economy. But what about the crime rates? Are they boosting those too? President Donald Trump seems to think so. Here he is speaking during the election.
The U.S. has become a dumping ground for everybody else's problems. When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're not sending you. They're not sending you. They're sending people that have lots of problems.
And they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some,
Jesus
I
Christ,
assume, are
man.
good people.
And now that he's president, Donald Trump is still very much focused on the crimes that immigrants commit. And the idea that immigrants come to America and commit a lot of crimes is something that we heard in Alabama too. While we were in Cullman, Heather and I wandered into a small but packed two-chair barbershop.
Hey, hello, girls.
Where a man named Charlie Heaton has been cutting hair for decades. He knows just about everyone in town, even our farmer.
Yes, I know Jeremy Calvert.
So we had a chat.
He comes in here.
Oh, the young boy?
Yeah, Jeremy.
What kind of haircut does he get?
Regular. He gets a regular farming haircut. There you go.
The guy sitting in Charlie's chair is a heavy-set cattle farmer with a chin for days. And as he told Heather, he's not a fan of the Mexicans in his area.
Yeah, them Mexicans ain't like everybody thinks they are.
What are they like?
What they like? Yeah, them cheating, lying son of a gun.
Are all Mexicans?
No. They might be a few good ones. They ain't too many good ones. I know some good ones.
Jesus.
I really do.
Charlie, our barber with the regular-sized chin, was worried about the immigrants bringing in drugs.
The Mexicans, they sell and buy drugs a lot more.
The idea that immigrants bring crime is pretty common. Surveys suggest that a third of Americans think that any immigrant who comes to the US increases crime. And when you ask specifically about undocumented immigrants, more than half of Americans think they drive up crime. So, is this true? Well, it's actually incredibly difficult to divvy up the crime stats in America between documented and undocumented immigrants because the authorities don't publicly release data on the immigration status of convicted criminals.
What a fucked up
And when it
world we
comes
live
to
in,
immigrants
seriously.
and drug crime, that's Charlie's biggest gripe, it's not easy to decipher that either. But there are two big sources of data that we can look at. First, the FBI. Their drug-related crime data is patchy. And one researcher we contacted who had dug into that patchy data found no clear effect of immigration on drug crimes. The second place we could get this information from is prisons, to see how many criminals inside them are immigrants and how many aren't. Again, though, there's very little data to work with. We did find one paper using prison data from 1986, which showed that immigrants on average were incarcerated for more drug crimes than the general population. But the researchers gave many caveats. Among them, they wrote that it was impossible to know whether or not the people who were arrested were actual immigrants or just professional drug smugglers who never intended to immigrate. So, until there's more research, we can't go much further with the question of drug crimes. Now, there is more research when it comes to property and violent crimes. So let's check these out. And to do that, we're going to head over to another place in the world that is also worried about this stuff and where there's some great research: the UK. Last year, concerns about foreigners reached fever pitch in the UK during the lead up to the Brexit vote, when campaigners were yelling that immigrants jack up crime. This is Nigel Farage, a key player in the pro-Brexit campaign.
Whether it's burglary or sexual assaults, it's very difficult for us to stop people with criminal records coming into Britain. And certainly, once they're in Britain, it's almost impossible to stop them residing here.
Brian Bell, an economist at King's College London, has looked into this. And Brian, he's more British than a cheeky Nando's. His family has lived in England for a very long time.
We've always lived in Britain. I think we've been here since 1066.
Wow. So did one of your ancestors colonise Australia, or were they sent as a convict to Australia?
I'm sure we didn't have any convicts in our family.
Brian recently studied how two large immigrant waves to the UK affected crime. The first were mainly asylum seekers who came in the late 1990s and early 2000s. They came from Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, and the former Yugoslavia. A second wave of foreigners came from the European Union.
Mainly Polish, some Hungarians, Latvians, Lithuanians. So all of the East European countries that joined the European Union in 2004.
Brian looked at how these waves of immigrants affected violent crime rates. That is, murder, assault, rape, as well as property crimes, breaking into houses, stealing cars, and shoplifting. He said that when it came to violent crimes, immigrants had no effect. And this is consistent with other work in the field.
None of these immigrant groups, and none of the immigrant groups that I've seen across any study that's been done, suggests any effect on violent crime.
But what about property crime? Well, when the Eastern Europeans came, there was no effect.
At the margin, in fact, it looks like they reduced crime in areas they went to. There was certainly no increase.
But for the asylum seekers, that first wave?
What we found was there was some small increase in property crime in areas where they went to.
And how big was the increase in property crime when you look at the refugees that came?
So it's a really small effect.
Ultimately, he found that if you had a town of 10,000 people and 100 asylum seekers moved there, the property crime rate would increase by 1.1%.
Realistically, if you lived in an area where there were a collection of asylum seekers, you wouldn't have noticed any change in the crime rate.
Now, Brian has a theory for why there was a difference between asylum seekers and the other immigrants. And that is that asylum seekers who came to the UK couldn't work while their applications for asylum were under review, while immigrants from the European Union, they could work.
And, people who have jobs tend not to commit property crime because they've worked out that working legally is a better deal than committing crime.
And Brian says that other studies have reached the same conclusion.
A study that was done in Italy using a very similar kind of approach that we did, and a study in the United States that did, again, a very similar kind of approach. Both of those studies found that, on average, there was very little effect of immigrants on crime.
The growing consensus here is that when immigrants arrive to a country with the right to work, they don't increase the crime rate. In fact, they may even lower it. Among the many papers we read that found this, one paper said no matter where immigrants to the US come from, they are, quote, less likely to engage in violent or non-violent antisocial behaviours than native-born Americans, end quote. I asked Brian about the disconnect between public perceptions and scientific findings. Why do you think that people are so sure that immigrants are causing crime when the evidence isn't there to show it?
In some sense, you could argue it's because we're asking different questions. What academics are asking is what's the average effect? That's different from asking a question of, if 10 new immigrants arrive in my town, does that mean I'm definitely not going to see an increase in crime? Well, no, it doesn't, because just like if 10 new natives arrived in your town, they might be bad people and they might commit crime.
And what about Alabama? What happened to the crime when the immigrants here left? Last year, researchers from Texas A&M University tracked the crime rates in Alabama from before and after the law kicked in. And they found that when the immigrants left, the violent crime rate rose. And the property crime rate, it stayed about the same. I put our research to Charlie over at the barbershop in Cullman as he gave his farmer a regular farming haircut.
We've been looking at something like the data, like the science, the studies on like crime rates and like who's causing more crime.
Yeah, I don't know nothing about that.
Yeah, and interestingly, it like tends to find that immigrants who come to America do less crime, have a lower crime rate than Americans. Would that surprise you?
I don't know. I can see what you're saying, because if they commit crime, they're going to draw attention to themselves and they'll get deported. I can see that statistic being right.
In 2014, researchers studying why immigrants commit less crime on average wrote, quote, "One simple explanation is that immigrants have a lot to lose, including deportation, and avoiding law enforcement is an especially good idea when you are in a new and strange land," end quote. Interestingly though, while immigrants have a lower crime rate on average than Americans, it seems that the children of immigrants are significantly more likely to be involved in crime than their parents. And there are all sorts of reasons as to why this might be. Are the kids of immigrants caught between the old world and the new world? Are they angry and frustrated? Or are they just becoming like the Americans around them? Here's Sam Addy from the University of Alabama.
So the crime rate of immigrants. Now, it's lower than the rest of the population. But when you get to the second and third generations, they become like the rest of us.
And why is that?
They've assimilated.
Yes, they assimilate. And then they're just as likely to commit crimes as any other American. Not more, not less. Conclusion. While there might be a slight bump in property crime rates when immigrants come without the right to work, new immigrants commit fewer crimes on average than people who were born in the US. So, when it comes to science versus immigration, do the fears stack up? First, are immigrants taking American jobs? For the most part, no. Immigrants are not running people out of work because when they come to America, they bring new demand and that creates jobs. Second, do immigrants lower wages? Well, some groups, specifically those without a high school education, may see a wage drop. Now, while the consensus is that their wages aren't dropping by very much, living on minimum wage in the US is hard enough as it is, so any drop can have an impact. But still, on average, for the whole country, immigrants don't affect wages. Third, are they taking more from the American government than they give? Well, immigrants cost more than Americans do, but their kids, they give more than other Americans do. So spending on immigrants isn't really a drain. It's more like an investment. And finally, what about crime? Well, immigrants who come without the right to work might boost the property crime rate, but not by much. And otherwise, if they are allowed to work, immigrants do not affect the crime rate, and in fact, might even lower it. With clear evidence showing that immigrants don't wreck the job market for Americans or drain public funds or commit lots of crimes, why all the hollering about getting rid of them? Well, one explanation is that as Americans have lost higher paying jobs and as they struggle to stay in the middle class, they look around and see people who don't look or speak like them. And then they fall into this pattern that scientists have seen over and over again.
People very, very naturally build groups and they identify insiders and outsiders.
Dan Hopkins is a political scientist at the University of Pennsylvania.
Extensive research shows that people, even with very, very minimal groups, can immediately start to favor the in-group and to dislike the out-group.
And these groups can be about practically anything. Americans and non-Americans, deplorables and non-deplorables, whites and non-whites. And that this tendency to create in-groups and out-groups is almost baked into the human psyche. It creates an opening for people trying to push an agenda because it's just such an easy button to push. But still, now, while the consensus is that their wages aren't dropping by very much, living on minimum wage in the US is hard enough as it is, so any drop can have an impact. But still, on average, for the whole country, immigrants don't affect wages. Third, are they taking more from the American government than they give? Well, immigrants cost more than Americans do, but their kids, they give more than other Americans do. So spending on immigrants isn't really a drain. It's more like an investment. And finally, what about crime? Well, immigrants who come without the right to work might boost the property crime rate, but not by much. And otherwise, if they are allowed to work, immigrants do not affect the crime rate, and in fact, might even lower it. With clear evidence showing that immigrants don't wreck the job market for Americans or drain public funds or commit lots of crimes, why all the hollering about getting rid of them? Well, one explanation is that as Americans have lost higher paying jobs and as they struggle to stay in the middle class, they look around and see people who don't look or speak like them. And then
They fall into this pattern that scientists have seen over and over again.
People very, very naturally build groups and they identify insiders and outsiders.
Dan Hopkins is a political scientist at the University of Pennsylvania.
Extensive research shows that people, even with very, very minimal groups, can immediately start to favor the in-group and to dislike the out-group.
And these groups can be about practically anything. Americans and non-Americans, deplorables and non-deplorables, whites and non-whites. And that this tendency to create in-groups and out-groups is almost baked into the human psyche. It creates an opening for people trying to push an agenda because it's just such an easy button to push.
Yeah, exactly. There is an existing set of sentiments that can quite readily be tapped into.
But curiously, while we humans do have a tendency to pop people into groups, most Americans actually aren't necessarily putting immigrants into the get out of my country group. A 2016 survey from Pew found that 60% of Americans see immigrants as a strength rather than as a burden to the US. And that is at its highest level in more than 20 years. So despite what we keep hearing about and reading about in the news, we're closer than you'd think to accepting the science on immigration. And that is that overall, people who come to the US from other countries ultimately make their new home a more prosperous place. That's Science versus Immigration. This episode has been produced by Heather Rogers, Shruti Ravindran, and me. Caitlin Story is our senior producer. Production assistance by Ben Kiebrick. We're edited by Annie Rose Strasser. Fact-checking by Michelle Harris. Sound engineering, music production, and original music written by Bobby Lord. Thanks to Dr. Anna Phil-Dam, Professor Charisse Kubrin, Assistant Professor George Spenkuch, Professor Kristen Butcher, and Ramiro Martinez, as well as the Zuckerman family. Thanks for your help. And just before you go, we have a little challenge for you. In the next week, we want you to grab the phone of a friend and subscribe them to Science Versus. Like, actually just get their phone, show them the podcast app, and subscribe them to Science Versus. You can subscribe 1 friend or 3 or 10, and we will be very happy. That's the prize you get. You've made us happy. Thanks, guys. Next up on your feed, it's Science Versus Acne. And next week, we tackle climate change. How bad is this really going to get?
Sometimes you feel like this buzzard of doom sitting on everyone's shoulder.
I'm Wendy Zuckerman. Fact you next time. Hi, I'm Wendy Zuckerman, and you're listening to Science Versus from Gimlet Media. Today, we're tackling acne.
Are you excited to have your skin fixed? I'm just pretty skeptical at this point. It's just like, blah, blah, blah with your bullshit.
Caitlin Sori has adult acne. It's not that bad, but it can really get her down. And she's been sold a lot of stuff in her time to get her skin clear.
Okay, started with creams, face washes, toners, masks, scrubs. I've cut out dairy, bread, been to clinics that have spent a lot of money doing very strange things to my face. Even like home remedies. Turmeric is the funniest one because it makes your face bright yellow. It feels like a 10-year-long experiment on my face.
Why do you want to get rid of your pimples? As soon as I have a breakout, I immediately think that everyone is looking at it. I can't talk to anyone new without thinking that they definitely can't be attracted to me because what's on my face?
Pimples are something that almost everyone has had to deal with, and it can drag on into adulthood. One survey found that 40% of adults still deal with their zits in their 30s. And this issue is more than skin deep. For some, it can be really stressful. Studies have found that people with acne have higher rates of anxiety, depression, and social withdrawal. And even if you've got no skin in this game and you don't get acne, admit it. You've judged people who have it. You've looked at their scars and their pimply red face and you've thought to yourself, wow, where did they go wrong? One small study found that almost 70% of those surveyed said that they would feel ashamed if they had acne. So between the judgments on one side and the self-loathing on the other, People with acne are the perfect targets for companies flogging cures.
You know the worst thing about breakouts? Never knowing when the next one's gonna pop up. Do you have acne and wake up wishing you could hide your face from the world?
Boost your confidence morning to night.
After Caitlin complained to me about all the treatments she'd tried, I thought maybe a high-end skin store in Brooklyn might have a solution.
Look, this could be it. This could be the day. Today's the day.
There were dream catchers and everything was very white. It smelt great.
Hello. I'm Jill. Hey, Jill. How you doing? Hey, I'm Katie.
Jill is a buyer for the store. She was wearing a faux fur wrap and it felt like she floated out to us. Katie told her about her acne troubles.
I'm trying to fix my skin and it's been a real drama for a long time. No one can see my face because of the pimple. Exactly. They're just saying the pimple. The pimple is talking to them, saying, hi, my name's Caitlin.
And Jill said she could definitely help.
Did you say definitely? You can help. Yeah, definitely.
Jill says that acne can erupt for a whole lot of different reasons.
Like a lot of people say when they move to New York, it's like an atmosphere thing and all the pollution in the air really screws their skin up. Whenever the weather changes, whenever you have a baby and your hormones shift. Diet is another little piece of the puzzle.
And of course, she sells solutions. There were creams, serums, and finally, Jill points to something that you might not associate with acne at all. Probiotics. That's the good bacteria that you find in yogurt.
Like you always want to get your gut settled too. That's why we sell Ingestible Beauty.
How much is this guy?
70. Do we have evidence to show that if you make your belly healthier, your pimples go down? Like when you say evidence, like I'm not sure what you mean. It's not that scientific here. It's like girlfriend vibes. Like when you come in, it's like, oh, I've tried that. I really like it. Like you should try it too.
And the thing is, the acne industry is profiting quite a bit off all of these girlfriend vibes. Americans fork out $2.5 billion each year trying to treat acne. So today, we're putting the skincare industry and all the marketing hype under the microscope. Because when it comes to acne, there are lots of girlfriend vibes. But then there's science. Today, we get to the bottom of what works and what doesn't. Science versus Acne is coming up just after the break.
This episode is brought to you by FedEx. FedEx delivers more than just packages. They're working toward delivering a more sustainable future. This initiative is called Priority Earth, and the goal is to reach carbon neutral operations by 2040. FedEx says they're also starting to modernize its fleet by adding zero-emission electric vehicles and creating more recyclable packaging. Priority Earth is the most important delivery FedEx is making yet, because it's an address we all share, Earth. FedEx, where now meets next. To learn more, visit fedex.com/sustainability.
This episode is brought to you by delicious Bear Snacks. Between cryotherapy, goat yoga, and smoothies made with things you can't even pronounce, wellness can feel a bit complicated. But there's a simpler way to wellness. Bear Snacks. They're a tasty, crunchy snack made simply of apples. With Bear Snacks, less is more. Buy Bear Snacks now at most grocery retailers nationwide.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. Don't wait for great talent to find you. Find them first with Indeed. It's the hiring platform where you can do everything in one place. And it has powerful hiring tools to help find qualified candidates quickly, like Instant Matching. It can help find candidates the moment you sponsor a job. Join the more than 3 million businesses already using Indeed. Start hiring now with the $75 job credit at Indeed.com/science. Tap the banner to learn more. Offer good for a limited time.
Acne. It can range from one zit on your nose to a few pimples on your cheek to those painful swollen lumps that can be so large they connect together. It can be something that pops up once a month or that feels like it takes over your life and your face. To scientists, it's just all called acne, severe, moderate, or mild. And to some observers, acne is like a billboard on someone's face, advertising their behavior. That is, The ones with zits are the ones to blame for their bad skin. So it's time to clear things up. The questions that Science Versus will face off against today are: 1. Why do people get acne? 2. Can changing your diet do anything for your skin? 3. Which treatments of acne actually work? And we'll walk you through the medication that dermatologists are raving about and ask, what are the risks of taking it? Okay, before we get too deep into the claims of how to counteract the pus, let's do a little pimple 101. To do that, it's time to meet our dermatologist, and he suffered from spots when he was a teen.
My mother used to take me to the dermatologist. Sometimes you don't want to admit it, but your mother actually does know best.
This is Dr. Jonathan Weiss. He helped write the 2016 clinical guidelines for the treatment of acne for the American Dermatology Academy. He's also treated acne for decades and has been involved in dozens of trials for different acne medications. Basically, he's the perfect guy to ask, what is going on when you get a pimple? He told me to imagine that I was watching it all unfold from the inside.
Okay, so you're sitting inside the hair follicle and you are totally normal.
You see, it all starts inside a hair follicle. That's where the hair is coming out of. So you're sitting there inside the hair follicle, and what you'd see is the root of the hair, but if you looked up, you'd also normally see an opening. That's where the hair pops out of. But when a pimple is emerging, that opening starts getting clogged by dead skin cells that are hanging around on your skin, along with a protein that's made by skin cells called keratin.
The first thing you see looking up is somebody plugging you up.
Making matters worse, attached to your follicle are oil glands pumping out oil, and that oil is now getting trapped inside the hair follicle. And bacteria on the skin may start multiplying as they make a picnic on that oil. And this now is starting to attract white blood cells.
You look outside and all of a sudden you see these white blood cells coming at you. And white blood cells are what cause inflammation. So it's like you're sitting in the hair follicle and you're being attacked a little bit from above and below. And lo and behold, you're starting to scream that, oh my gosh, I'm going to become a pimple.
While Jonathan told us a simple story of a pimple starting, the curious thing is that science is still figuring out exactly who starts this pimple party. Was it really the pore that got clogged first? Was it the bacteria attracting the white blood cells? Or would the white blood cells have crashed that party anyway?
Why are the white blood cells suddenly coming into my hair follicle?
That is the million-dollar question right now.
And it could be that different types of pimples start in different ways, because there's a whole family of pimples out there. There's blackheads, those little black dots. They actually have nothing to do with the skin being dirty, but rather when dead skin cells and oil in the hair follicle aren't covered by a layer of skin, they react with the oxygen in the air to turn black, becoming blackheads. Whiteheads are basically the same thing, with a little layer of skin on top of the dead skin cells and the oil, meaning they're never exposed to oxygen, and so they don't turn black and instead look white. Then there's those 3D pimples that are easy to pop. They're called pustules, and they happen when the white blood cells come to the pimple party. In fact, it's those cells mixed in with oil and a bit of dead skin that you're popping, and they
form what we would normally call lovingly pus. And so that becomes a pustule, and that's what you're popping. And if you're really good, you can hit the mirror with it from about 2 feet away.
hit the mirror. Ugh. Anyway, then there's the bumps on the skin. They're the ones that you want to squeeze, but you can't get anything out of them. They're called papules. And finally, the Dante's Peak pimple. That happens when the hair follicle has been filling up with so much oil, bacteria, and white blood cells that it can actually implode the hair follicle. These guys can look like red mountains, and they're called cystic acne. So, those are the main types of pimples out there. Next question. How do you get rid of them? Will laying off the chocolate and the pizza clean up your pizza face?
diet has been a question in acne since I was a kid and went to my dermatologist. And he could say, you ate a potato chip, didn't you?
And even before Jonathan was a kid, back in the 1940s and 50s, many dermatologists believed that acne was linked to eating chocolate, sweets, and fried foods. In fact, a paper written in 1941 suggested that acne is worse in summer, partly because of a, quote, gross increase in oil intake on account of the popularity of ice cream, end quote. But then in the late 60s, something changed. A paper was published in 1969 which tested whether diet was connected to acne. And the authors wrote that when it came to acne, quote, the list of forbidden foods has one remarkable feature. All of the blacklisted items are delicious and delectable to the adolescent taste, end quote. And they picked out one particular food that always seemed to be suspected of causing acne, writing, quote, none is more universally condemned than chocolate, end quote. And so the researchers wanted to give chocolate a fair trial.
My chocolate, my beautiful chocolate.
To do that, they got 65 people, gave half of them a chocolate bar to eat each day, and gave the other half a so-called placebo bar. That was a sweet bar that had no chocolate in it. Several weeks later, there was no difference in the acne of either group. Another paper, published soon after, found that acne wasn't linked to consuming milk, peanuts, Coke, or chocolate. After that, many dermatologists stopped thinking that diet was linked to acne. By the early 1970s, it was already being written that special diets to avoid spots were unnecessary and may even lead to the disruption of family eating habits. But the thing is, those papers were hardly conclusive. Take that chocolate paper with the placebo bar. For one, that so-called placebo bar had about the same amount of fat and sugar in it as the chocolate bar did. So that doesn't tell us anything about whether fat and sugar can give you acne, only that maybe cocoa isn't the culprit. Second problem, there were only 65 people in that study. And third problem, word on the research street is that Hershey's funded the paper. That's amazing that one Hershey-sponsored study was able to drive the industry for quite a while.
Absolutely. But it's pretty typical of what went on back then.
Fast forward to today, and we still don't have that many studies on diet. There has been some research, particularly focusing on sugar and acne, but the studies are usually really small. One recent review paper found that there's no clear evidence that you're more likely to get acne whether you chow down on sugar or not. The truth is, we don't fully understand how your diet might give you plooks. Plooks. That's how you say acne in Scotland. Anyway, some work does suggest that high sugar diets might affect oil production on your face, but we don't really know. Curiously, there have been studies into a potential link with milk. Several studies have found that the more milk teens drank, the higher their risk of acne. But it's unclear why. Possibly because of the sugars in the milk, or maybe because the milk is influencing hormones, or maybe it has nothing to do with milk and this is actually just a correlation. The thing is, when it comes to the link between acne and diet, we just don't have enough evidence either way. And Jonathan has an idea as to why that might be.
Quite honestly, most studies today are sponsored by pharmaceutical companies or by people who have a commercial interest in the condition.
So, without conclusive research, when pimpled up teens come into Jonathan's office, he doesn't tell them not to eat dairy or chocolate. But he does say to his patients that since eating less sugar is probably good for you generally and it might help you with your acne, why not give a healthier diet a go?
The evidence is definitely not definitive, but I think it's good enough and it's a generally healthy diet that it's worth telling them about it. But it's really not standard medical practice right now to say, restrict sugars because it makes your acne worse.
Conclusion. The evidence isn't there to show that what you eat will appear on your face. Enough studies just haven't been done. Okay, so what's at the drugstore? Will any of those products clear up your acne? Let's go shopping. I went to the store with Caitlin Sori, who you heard from at the beginning of the show. She's still struggling with acne and girlfriend vibes.
Fucking Christ.
And Caitlin,
I'm getting sick
she's
of this
actually
fucking
our
game.
senior producer here at Science Versus. So we really wanted to help her out.
This is what these stores are so big. I can't find anything. I always find myself at the lolly section, and I'm like, how did I even get
fucking
here?
gear.
There might seem like a lot of products on the market, but when Caitlin and I got down to it, there were really only a couple.
Let's go from the right to the left. Benzoyl peroxide formula, salicylic acid. Benzoyl peroxide. Salicylic acid. Benzoyl peroxide. Salicylic acid. Benzoyl peroxide. Benzoyl peroxide. Ooh, this is my favorite. Deep action. Oh, here it is. The Light Therapy Acne Mask. The power of light therapy to treat breakouts. Do you want to try this? I kind of do.
Now, time for Caitlin to try out her new acne treatment. Let's do this. You gotta open it. You gotta open this packet.
Can't even kill the fucking trash.
It's an all-white plastic mask that looks like a hockey mask with little blue and red LED lights on the inside so that when you turn it on, you glow a pinky purple colour.
All right, it's going on my face.
It's now in your...
So I've got to leave it on for 10 minutes.
10 minutes.
Okay, here we go. Do I have to hold it down? Oh, there we go.
Wow!
Whoa. All right. Forget the skeptics. Forget the naysayers. Forget the little voice inside of me that says this is bullshit.
It's not a little voice, it's me right here.
I'm going to give it a go. I'm going to give it the benefit of the doubt and see what happens, okay?
10 minutes on the clock.
Okay.
Starts now. Okay, we'll explain the science of this mask soon, but while we wait for the mask to do its magic, let's leave Caitlin looking like an honorary member of Daft Punk. Rewind and look at those other two products at the drugstore.
Benzoyl peroxide formula, salicylic acid. Benzoyl peroxide, salicylic acid. Benzoyl peroxide, salicylic acid.
Let's start with salicylic acid. What does it do? Well, remember how a pimple can start forming when the opening to the hair follicle gets plugged up with dead skin and protein? And if that plug turns black, then you get a blackhead. Well, salicylic acid is an exfoliant. So the idea here is that you can pop that potential pimple's door right open. Here's Jonathan, our dermatologist.
So it can help by unplugging hair follicles a little bit.
And it's pretty popular. Last year, more than $130 million was spent on acne products with salicylic acid in it around the world. The problem is that salicylic acid has not been studied that well. The American Academy of Dermatology guidelines, which Jonathan helped write, called clinical trials into salicylic acid limited. And another paper published in Nature Reviews noted that we don't have sufficient medical literature to say that salicylic acid is effective for acne. Jonathan says it might be helpful for some people with mild acne, but...
Salicylic acid has not absolutely been tested. It's relatively weak, and we don't see it in any, to my knowledge, products that I certainly use for the treatment of acne.
So what about that other product that we saw on the shelves at the local chemist, benzoyl peroxide? If you've ever used it, you know you end up with bleach stains all over your clothes, towel, and sheets. And that's because benzoyl peroxide is a bleach. Fun fact, it has been used for over 50 years to bleach flour and milk to make Italian cheeses. So, it'll bleach your sheets, but will it fix your acne? Well, remember how we told you about that bacteria that might be picnicking on the oil on your skin to get the pimple party started? Well, benzoyl peroxide works by killing bacteria on your skin.
Benzoyl peroxide just kind of gets inside the bacteria and explodes it, if you will. We like to think of it as dropping a little bomb on them.
And that bomb is trying to target a particular bacteria called Propionibacterium acnes, or P. acnes as we'll call it. And when it comes to acne, this organism has been on researchers' radar since the turn of the century. And that's because back in the lab, when
they cultured a lesion, it came through that it was this organism.
And since benzoyl peroxide bombs this little bacteria, it actually can reduce the number of pimples on your face.
It's quite clear that benzoyl peroxide has been scientifically proven.
But if you are going to give it a go, there's no clear evidence that higher strength options like 10% work better than 2.5 or 5%. So it's recommended that you go for the lower strength because it can cause irritation. Still, according to Jonathan, it definitely won't clear up everyone's skin. And the reason that benzoyl peroxide isn't an amazing cure-all is because, well, acne can come about from a range of things besides bacteria. We talked about oil and dead skin cells, but there's other stuff like genetics. One study of more than 1,000 teens found that having someone else in your family with spots doubled the risk of you getting severe to moderate acne. Caitlin, our senior producer, points the finger at her dad.
Thanks, Dad.
Hormones can also play a role in how oily your skin is, which is why teenagers whose hormones are changing are more likely to get pimples, and why women with acne can be put on birth control pills that contain estrogen to tweak their hormones. Finally, stress could be a factor. While there's not a lot of research here, a recent paper which reviewed a whole bunch of studies on acne described stress as a, quote, potential risk factor, end quote. This was partly hinged on a link found between stress and a protein that's involved in oil production called substance P. Yes, we know, it sounds like something that created the Powerpuff Girls. Substance P. But seriously, that's what it's called. And all these factors are why washing your face will not rid you of pimples. A Lancet paper found that there is, quote, no good evidence that acne is caused or cured by washing, end quote. So to take this idea back to the Daft Punk / light therapy mask on Caitlin's face right now.
I powered down.
Oh, it powered down.
Okay, I'm done.
The idea of the light therapy mask is that it uses two types of light. Blue light is supposed to zap P. acnes bacteria on your face, and red light is supposed to decrease inflammation. And oh my God, the pimple's gone.
Is it?
No. You look exactly the same.
I thought so.
To be fair, you are supposed to use the mask over several weeks, and just so you know, it says it's only useful for mild to moderate acne. Plus, this is a sample size of
I don't even know what to do anymore. I'm so tired of this fucking game.
But anyway, if Caitlin went
I don't
on
know how
Daft
fucking
Punk
Rax
Patrol
played this
for a
game
month,
for fucking
what's the
since it
chances
came
her
out.
pimples would go away?
Seriously.
A Cochrane review, which is a systematic review of the major research on a particular topic, looked at the use of shining coloured light on your face to get rid of pimples. And it found two small studies of around 30 people that suggested blue-red light therapies might be better than placebos. But overall, the Cochrane review, which was published in 2016, noted that, quote, high-quality evidence on the use of light therapies for people with acne is lacking, end quote.
Oh, fuck.
And it's why Jonathan remains unconvinced.
I think it's another gimmick in my mind right now. A lot of treatments begin in one form and move on to another. So my mind's open that there might be some light system in the future that might work.
Conclusion. Light masks are definitely a great Halloween outfit, but there's no conclusive evidence that they'll help you with your acne. Other things at the drugstore, like benzoyl peroxide, could be helpful, but it won't necessarily clear your skin entirely. As for salicylic acid, the evidence for that isn't good. Now, while researching this episode, we came across some pretty interesting information about little old P. acnes. Cue the music. So, for decades, scientists suspected that P. acnes could be the bacteria that led to acne. It's named after it, for goodness sakes. Did you get that? P. acnes, acne? Anyway, but remember what Jonathan said?
Every time they cultured a lesion, it came through that it was this organism.
Well, get this. It turns out that P. acnes is found on healthy skin too. Our skin and body is teeming with bacteria, and P. acnes is the most common bacteria on our faces, on clear faces, pimpled faces, freckled faces, moon faces. In one study, it made up 90% of the bugs hanging out on people's faces. So, what is going on here? How can P. acnes cause acne but be found on healthy people's faces too? Well, one group of scientists now believe that there are different strains of the bacteria, some strains that make it more likely that your skin will get pimples. Dr. Huying Lee and her colleagues at the University of California, Los Angeles uncovered this unexpected P. acnes surprise a few years ago.
What I learned from my research is not all bacteria are bad. Some are good, some are bad. They're not really equal.
She found several strains of P. acnes that were more likely to be found deep inside the follicles of people with acne. But she found other strains that, as you heard her say, were good strains that might actually be protecting the skin from the bad bacteria. And those good strains of P. acnes? Well, they might help you to avoid acne because they take the space and the food of the bad strains. You can think of them as double agents on your skin.
It's a good time to appreciate what these tiny, tiny creatures do for us.
Thanks, tiny creatures. After the break, can popping your pimples help? We meet the internet celebrity known as Dr. Pimple Popper to find out.
This is science, man. See? We don't mess around.
This episode is brought to you by FedEx. FedEx delivers more than just packages. They're working toward delivering a more sustainable future. This initiative is called Priority Earth, and the goal is to reach carbon neutral operations by 2040. FedEx says they're also starting to modernize its fleet by adding zero-emission electric vehicles and creating more recyclable packaging. Priority Earth is the most important delivery FedEx is making yet, because it's an address we all share, Earth. FedEx, where now meets next. To learn more, visit fedex.com/sustainability.
So we've looked at some of the big treatments on the market with mixed results, but one of the most tempting things to do when you have acne is to pop your pimples. But should you? Is it bad for you? And could it help your acne? We've got just the person to answer these questions, and we went to sunny LA to meet her. Welcome to LA, baby. Dr. Pimple Popper, aka Dr. Sandra Lee, is a dermatologist with over 2 million subscribers on her YouTube channel, which shows her popping her patients' pimples and cysts.
Good ones. Sometimes you're kind of impressed by how much comes out of one little pore there.
Oh yeah, it's just so fucking impressive.
Hello.
Let me waste my fucking time watching you do that, seriously.
Oh, really? Thank you. They're like pajamas.
We watched one of her videos together. A patient had come to see her with a back full of blackheads.
So this is blackheads for days.
Do you do the titles?
Yeah, usually I do the title.
I like the title.
Oh, thank you.
She used a little metal tool to squeeze out those blackheads. As she did, all these little snakes of dead skin cells, keratin and oil popped out.
So this is the part that people like to watch. This is more like it's very pleasing.
Goodness. I say, I'm gonna be fine. Okay. Science.
Yep. Over 2 million subscribers. That means millions of people around
Why
the
do
world
people
are
like watching
her
that fucking
pop
shit?
Pimples. It's an online community that calls themselves Popaholics. And Sandra now self-identifies as one.
I am a born-again popaholic.
A few years ago, Sandra had no idea about Popaholics or this corner of the internet until she posted a video online from her dermatology practice. And it went nuts.
It just started to flip and I couldn't even get on my phone.
She thought, wow, I'm onto something here. Some people love watching pimples get popped.
I'm like their queen. I could be their queen. So like, I'm like, let me just put some more up there. And so that's what happened. It was just 2 years ago.
Why do you think they really love it?
They're relaxing. There's a cleansing feeling, like you're getting rid of something that is not supposed to be there.
I had to ask the queen of the popaholics, should you pop your pimples? And despite her reputation and her name, she says that sometimes you really shouldn't be a poppin'.
You know, if it's deeper under the skin, you can't. The more you squeeze it, the more it'll just get more swollen and inflamed and potentially bigger. For example, I have a pimple right now on my chin that I've been feeling.
Where is this?
You can feel it. You can feel it, but you can't see because it's coming out.
The reason you shouldn't go hacking into these pimples is because it can lead to scarring. Now, there's not a lot of studies that have looked into how many people who pop their pimples actually get scars. One study of less than 200 people who ended up in a dermatologist's office to treat acne found that 95% of them had some acne scars. But that's probably at the extreme end. Another survey of more than 2,000 people from the general population found that only 1% had acne scarring. Sandra says that once you start opening wounds, you can also increase your risk of getting an infection, which could mean more white blood cells and more inflammation and nastier pimples. We couldn't find any studies on how often this happens though. It's based on the experience of dermatologists, and it's why many dermatologists, including Jonathan Weiss, who you heard from, have a standard line and they say you should never pop your pimples. But Dr. Sandra Lee reckons there is a time when you probably can.
You know, I think there's a perfect time to pop your pimples, and it's really when it comes to a head. You have to wait for it to come to the surface.
So these are the pimples that are really easy to squeeze and pop. And Sandra says if you are going in, be sure to use a clean workspace. And if the pimple is not popping, give up, because forcing it can make your skin worse. The key here is this.
Know when to pop and know when to stop.
Once you pop, you can't stop.
Even the guidelines from the American Academy of Dermatology say that while there's not a lot of research on pimple popping, getting a professional to remove blackheads might be helpful. But will it stop you getting more pimples?
Me extracting blackheads and whiteheads, that's not going to prevent them from getting new blackheads or whiteheads. And it's just trying to help with the bumps that they have now. I'm not really treating their acne per se. I'm just trying to help make the appearance look better.
Conclusion. While you can probably pop some of those surface pimples with little harm and a little bit of satisfaction, there's so much we don't know here. You can end up permanently scarring your face or making your pimples worse. So, pop at your own peril. Now to our last treatment for acne that we're looking at today. And Dr. Pimple Popper says it blows everything else out of the water. You might know it as the brand name Accutane, which is no longer available in America. Other companies make a similar drug. The generic name is isotretinoin. But for this show, we'll keep calling it Accutane because that's what most people know it as.
Accutane is a fantastic medication. It will do things that no other medication does.
Dr. Sandra Lee, aka Dr. Pimple Popper, says there's nothing that comes close to the effectiveness of Accutane, particularly for bad or difficult to treat acne. That's the type that can be painful to touch, where the skin is covered in bumps and craters. This is where Accutane really comes into its own.
In other words, all these other medications, they might help your acne, they might not. There's nothing in between. Accutane can clear up most people's acne.
Accutane hit the US market in 1982 and it's been used by more than 13 million patients. It can cure around 85% of people's acne. That is, the pimples don't come back. So, how does it do this magic?
It's a megadose of vitamin A.
Jonathan Weiss again. And, well, he says Accutane isn't exactly vitamin A, it's an analog, which means it's a really, really similar chemical. And he says that megadose blocks the major processes in the body known to lead to acne. It can tweak how your genes express themselves and so shrink your oil glands and even change the way you make skin cells.
It changes the way the hair follicle grows. It changes the way the sebum or the oils are produced. And it gets some of the most severe acne under control.
So, it sounds like the miracle acne cure that sufferers have been waiting for. The only problem? There's some major side effects. It can massively dry out your skin, leaving it red and raw for the first month or so. And another much worse side effect is what can happen if a woman gets pregnant on Accutane, because ultimately this drug changes the way that cells divide and form.
And a fetus is just a ball of differentiating tissue. Differentiation is what means that a hair cell becomes a hair cell, and a skin cell becomes a skin cell, and a heart cell becomes a heart cell. If you're messing with that process, in a fetus, you're going to have a fetus that comes out malformed in some way.
So that's why drugs like Accutane are highly regulated in the United States. Before it's prescribed, a woman has to promise to use 2 different types of contraceptives, although almost a third of women admit they don't do this. The shadow that has hung over Accutane, though, doesn't have anything to do with malformed babies. The story that many people know is the link between Accutane and depression and suicide. And by the way, if you're someone who has or is experiencing depression, heads up, we will be talking about it a little bit. So if you're not feeling great, you can call the US National Suicide Prevention Lifeline on 1-800-273-8255. Okay, so in 1999, the 17-year-old son of Democratic Congressman Bart Stupak was prescribed Accutane for his acne. Several months later, he killed himself. Stupak went on national television and blamed his son's death on the prescription of Accutane. He successfully pushed to get a congressional hearing to investigate the safety of the drug. Here's Bart Stupak interrogating Accutane's maker, President and CEO of Hoffmann La Roche, George Abercrombie.
Does there appear to be a problem with Accutane, depression, suicide ideation, psychosis, and suicide?
Sir, there are no scientific data.
No, I didn't ask you that. I asked you, does there appear to be a problem, an association? I didn't ask for studies, an association between Accutane use, depression, suicide ideation, psychosis, and some suicide.
Again, sir, we base our conclusions on sound scientific principles and studies and data.
Around the same time, 15-year-old Charlie Bishop, who was taking Accutane, stole a plane and crashed it into a Bank of America building in Tampa, Florida. His mother blamed the drug and filed a lawsuit, which was later dropped. Other families started suing Hoffmann La Roche, alleging that Accutane was associated with their children's depression and suicide. After being the leader in acne treatment for almost 20 years, by the late 2000s, Accutane had lost more than 95% of the US market share to generics, and Hoffmann La Roche soon stopped selling Accutane in the US. A decision they said was partly based on the cost of defending personal injury lawsuits. And the thing is that many doctors think that Accutane and all the drugs with isotretinoin really can cause depression. It's something that Jonathan takes seriously.
When you've seen somebody get profoundly depressed after taking a medication, it's impressive, and it's something that you never forget and you never stop thinking about or discussing with patients.
Jonathan can remember the first time this happened. It was in the late 1980s, and he'd prescribed a very similar sister drug to Accutane.
And the poor kid got terribly depressed.
Jonathan didn't know what was going on with this kid, and so he sent him to a psychiatrist to figure it out.
I said, look, you're clearly depressed. I want you to seek some help. I sent him to a colleague of mine, and the colleague in psychiatry said, oh no, this can be a rare side effects of these vitamin A drugs. And he stopped the drug and he did fine.
But Jonathan says that this side effect, while incredibly serious, is also incredibly rare. He says there is likely a very small group of vulnerable people who respond really, really badly to the drug.
I've treated thousands of patients with isotretinoin and its sister drugs, and I have had this happen less than 5 times over 30 years.
In fact, this group of people is so small that when you look at large studies with lots of people on the drug, statistically, researchers can't even pick up that isotretinoin leads to depression in anyone. And that's because when the number of people affected by something is very small, that signal can get lost when you start to look at averages. And if your acne isn't that severe, there's drugs similar to Accutane called topical retinoids. And they come in a cream or gel and work in a similar way to Accutane or isotretinoin. But they have vastly different potencies, and because they're being applied directly to your skin rather than in pill form, which is absorbed through your gut and then gets into your blood, they have much milder side effects. Now, while there's not too many trials into topical retinoids and how effective they are at getting rid of acne, the ones that are around show that these creams can help reduce your spots. And actually, after researching this episode and conducting the experiment with her face while she was at it, senior producer Caitlin Sori found that using topical retinoids at night did reduce some of her pimples.
Thanks, science.
But just because it worked for Caitlin, it doesn't mean it'll work for you. We asked Jonathan about this.
With the current knowledge, do we have the data to be able to say things like, there is an 85% chance that your acne will go down if I give you this treatment?
The only treatment that I think we can say that about is isotretinoin right now. That people, that a vast majority will get significantly better on isotretinoin than they were when they started. But unfortunately, we can't say that about absolutely every treatment.
So we don't have that good data, that good studies on the other stuff.
No, we really don't.
So, when it comes to science versus acne, what works and what's to blame? Did that pizza give you pizza face? Well, there's no slam dunk evidence that diet is related to acne, but there are some small studies that link sugar and milk to getting pimples. Does stress make you break out? Well, there's no good evidence showing that it does, but there are some theoretical links. Substance P, my friends, substance P. There are good studies, though, linking acne to your genetics. Not that you can do anything about that. When it comes to treatment, what works? Light therapy masks look cool, but the evidence that they do anything for your acne is very slim. Benzoyl peroxide has some evidence that it works. Salicylic acid is not well researched. The only thing known to work really well on a lot of people is isotretinoin, aka Accutane. And it's mainly for severe acne. But will it make you depressed? Well, it's possible, but the chances of you getting depressed are actually very low. Still, if you're worried about it and you're feeling odd and you're on the drugs, please talk to your doctor. And even if you don't have depression, acne can really mess with your head. It can make you feel really bad and vulnerable. And there's a lot of people and companies exploiting your vulnerability and promising solutions.
Did you say definitely? You can help. Definitely.
The problem is, there's a lot less science out there. And if you don't know your facts, you can waste a lot of money and fall for just about anything.
And oh my God, the pimple's gone. Is it? No. You look exactly the same.
That's science versus acne. This episode has been produced by senior producer Caitlin Sori and me, as well as Heather Rogers and Shruti Ravindran. Production assistance by Ben Keebrick. We're edited by Annie Rose Strasser, fact-checking by Michelle Harris. Sound engineering, musical production and original scoring by Bobby Lord. Thanks to Dr. Robert Della Valle, Grandview Research, as well as Stevie Lane, Pat Walters, Rose Reed, the Zuckerman family, and Joseph Lavelle Wilson. Next Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time in the US, which is Friday at 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time in Australia, we're dropping climate change. Is there really an apocalypse coming?
Well, you're going to really nail me on it, aren't you?
And finally, if you're in New York, Science Versus is going to be performing a live show. at the Bell House on March 23rd, we're tackling coffee, wine, and chocolate. Are they really that good for you? Are they really that bad for you? Come meet us, say hello, learn science. It'll be great. March 23rd at the Bell House. All right, back to you next time.
Got ocean all around us. We can look down and see little.
Is that a dolphin?
Oh, that was a little dolphin. Yeah.
Oh, whoa!
Surprisingly small, though. I wonder what that was.
I'm Wendy Zuckerman, and you're listening to Science Versus from Gimlet Media. On today's show, Science versus Climate Change. We're pitting facts against our future. I'm walking on a pier in San Diego, California with Ralph Keeling. He's a professor at Scripps Institution of Oceanography.
Oh, and look at the school of fishes.
The dolphins went right by them. They must not be hungry.
Maybe they felt bad interrupting them while they were at school.
I can't touch that.
Yep, just two nerds hanging out. Ralph has taken me out on the pier to do something that his family has been doing for decades: collecting air samples. You see, Ralph's dad was a scientist too. His name was David Keeling, and David took the very first precise measurements of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Ralph tells me the air has to be pretty damn clean to get a good reading. So that's why we're out on the pier, to get as far away from traffic as possible. We even have to hold our breath when taking the sample, because when humans breathe, we breathe out carbon dioxide.
You wait until you're ready to take a sample, and then you hold your breath, and you walk into the wind.
Ralph whips out something that looks like a glass balloon. All the air has already been sucked out of it, so it creates a vacuum inside. And when Ralph carefully opens the vessel, air gets sucked in.
Now I close it off, and we have an air sample.
It's cool because you can't see it, and then it just makes these noises as to show this is a vacuum. And
that's one of the amazing things about this work, is that it's really Mother Nature speaking through what you're doing, and you're actually tapping into it.
Back in the 1950s, when Ralph's father started taking these carbon dioxide measurements, he learnt a lot from Mother Nature. In fact, those measurements helped create a new field of climate science and changed our understanding of the world in ways that we're still grappling with today. You see, when it comes to climate change, many of us still have a lot of doubts. A recent Pew survey found that less than half of Americans think that climate change is caused by humans, and the rest say it's either the result of natural causes or there's no evidence for it at all. Yet, 97% or more of climate scientists agree that it is extremely likely that climate change is caused by human activities. So, on today's show, we're going to go all the way back to the beginning of climate science, to when Ralph's father first started taking his measurements. And we're going to ask, how are scientists so sure that carbon dioxide is warming the world? And why do they think that humans are to blame? Then we're going to look into the climate change crystal ball to try to figure out, what is this warming going to do to our planet in the future? When it comes to climate change, there are lots of opinions. But then there's science. Science versus Climate Change is coming up just after the break. This episode is brought to you by FedEx. FedEx delivers more than just packages. They're working toward delivering a more sustainable future. This initiative is called Priority Earth, and the goal is to reach carbon neutral operations by 2040. FedEx says they're also starting to modernize its fleet by adding zero-emission electric vehicles and creating more recyclable packaging. Priority Earth is the most important delivery FedEx is making yet, because it's an address we all share: Earth. FedEx, where now meets next. To learn more, visit fedex.com/sustainability. Welcome back. We're starting our story of climate change in the 1950s when Ralph Keeling was just a kid and he used to go visit his father in his lab, and Ralph still remembers what it looked like.
Had all these glass tubes and pumps whirring, and there was a cartoon on television called Felix the Cat, who had this sort of mad scientist guy, Poindexter, who also had glassware that would occasionally blow up on him. My exposure to science consisted of that cartoon on television in my father's lab, and they were very concordant.
Let's go to the laboratory.
Now, while Felix the Cat was running in the background, the elder Keeling was working on this experiment that had nothing to do with climate science at first. Ralph's father was researching rocks, but for that project, he had to know how much carbon dioxide was in the air. And this was a problem, because at the time, there was no way to precisely measure carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So he had to invent something. And he did. A machine. Those were the noisy pumps that Ralph remembers. And this machine was a breakthrough, because before that, we could only get really rough estimates of how much carbon dioxide was in the atmosphere. But Ralph's dad's machine, it was the first that could very precisely measure how much CO2 was in the air. It could measure carbon dioxide down to parts per million.
What is parts per million? What does that actually mean?
So, yeah, if you have a million molecules of air, it means that out of those million, 315 are carbon dioxide molecules.
It's a tiny percentage.
Well, it's small, but sometimes things that are in small abundance matter.
And Ralph's dad, David, was just about to find out how important small things could be. In 1958, David's first measurement showed that there were around 313 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But he soon noticed that CO2 levels were creeping up and up and up. In 1969, a decade after he first started tracking it, he noted that carbon dioxide was up by 8 parts per million. David knew this was no anomaly. He later described it as unmistakable. And this was because he wasn't just going on one measurement. He helped set up instruments in other sites around the world, in Hawaii, Alaska, New Zealand, the South Pole, and even over the Pacific Ocean. Some pilots were recruited to capture air samples during Air Force recon flights. By the mid-1970s, the fact that carbon dioxide was going up was a scientific certainty, but that doesn't mean it felt like a big deal. Some of David's colleagues even thought that he should stop measuring it.
I think a lot of his colleagues thought, oh, you're nuts to keep that going.
But David, he did keep going. He didn't know exactly what the increasing numbers would mean for the world, but he felt that the change he was seeing was important and something worth keeping track of.
And so he realized that his work had a different kind of importance, because if he abandoned it, humanity would not know what was happening right now, and that ought to matter.
And then, in the late 1970s, scientists noticed another change. Teams all around the world saw that the average global surface temperature was rising too. Temperatures in the 1970s were about 0.5 degrees Celsius, or 0.9 Fahrenheit, warmer than almost 100 years before. And so, to explain it, scientists, including David Keeling, dug up this 100-year-old theory. You see, in the late 1800s, a Swedish chemist named Svante Arrhenius knew that carbon dioxide could absorb heat from the sun. So, he calculated that if we had more and more carbon dioxide, say by burning fossil fuels, it would absorb more and more heat, ultimately trapping heat inside the Earth's atmosphere and acting kind of like a blanket over our planet. But while a few scientists had pursued that theory back at the turn of the century, it hadn't really taken off. And that was pretty much because no one could measure carbon dioxide precisely enough to recognize the changes that were happening. That was until David Keeling invented that machine. But once David's data was out there, then his colleagues started thinking. Take this theory that Svante had, combine it with David's undeniable findings, and it was possible to explain why the world was getting warmer. Because of carbon. But there wasn't scientific consensus. In fact, a big National Academy of Sciences report written in 1983 said that while carbon dioxide was a compelling theory as to explain why the world might be warming, it was not yet confirmed as the culprit. Why? Because there were other suspects around. So, what were those other suspects? One of them was pretty explosive. Volcanoes. Some scientists thought that perhaps there hadn't been as many volcanic eruptions recently. Volcanic eruptions inject a whole bunch of junk into the stratosphere, ash, dust, and sulfur dioxide. And this stuff reflects sunlight away from the Earth. It can, in fact, cool parts of the world down. In the 18th century, a volcano erupted in northern Europe for 8 months, leaving the northern hemisphere about 1 degree Celsius colder than usual. So, some of those scientists noticing warming in the 1970s thought maybe fewer volcanoes were erupting and that was warming the world. To test this out, scientists looked through historical data and found that in the second half of the century, there actually were a bunch of eruptions in Mexico, the Philippines, and even more recently, in 2010, a volcano in Iceland spewed ash into the air for more than 5 weeks. Do you remember this one? It caused havoc to air traffic as well as reporters who couldn't pronounce it.
The glacier is called Eyjafjallajökull.
Eyjafjallajökull. Just think of, hey, you forgot your yogurt.
No, I've got it. So in 2010, the volcano spewed ash and dust in the air like other volcanoes recently. So, the number of eruptions hadn't changed on average, but the temperature of the world kept going up. So, scientists moved on. Some tried to find other explanations, pinning it on changes in how the Earth spins around the sun. Because the Earth can orbit just a touch closer or further away from the sun, sending our climate into a flux. Or perhaps it was changes in the sun's activity that was explaining this change in temperature. But the sun tends to power up and down in 11-year cycles, and the Earth's orbit changes over hundreds of thousands of years. They just didn't line up with the trends that scientists were seeing. So these were all ruled out too. Really, the big thing they kept turning back to was what that Swedish guy had said more than 100 years ago, that carbon dioxide was trapping heat from the sun and warming the world. And Ralph Keeling reckons that it's kind of incredible that this theoretical prediction from 100 years ago lines up with what we're actually seeing today.
It's a triumph of science. It doesn't feel like a triumph for humanity, but it was a triumph for science.
Back in Ralph's office, he showed me all the measurements that he and his dad have made.
So you're looking at carbon dioxide starting in 1950.
Almost 60 years of samples. And it's a graph with one line going up. And it's now called the Keeling curve.
315 parts per million, and they rise up to the right to something around 405 parts per million.
405 parts per million. So that's up 92 parts per million from when the Keelings first started measuring CO2. And when it comes to warming, the last 3 decades have each successively been the warmest decade at the Earth's surface since 1850. Okay, so thanks to the Keeling's work, we know that carbon dioxide is rising. We know that it's warming the world. But those facts alone don't mean that humans are responsible. So, how did science reach that conclusion? The thing is that carbon dioxide doesn't just come from burning fossil fuels. It's all around us. It's in the atmosphere, humans breathe it out, and plants absorb it when they grow. The oceans soak up and release carbon dioxide. In many ways, the planet is kind of constantly breathing in and out carbon dioxide. But carbon dioxide is also pumped out when we burn fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas. So, to find out whether more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was from the planet breathing or fossil fuels or something else, we have to investigate the carbon dioxide measurements that the Keelings and others have made. And this is something that Chris Field, a professor of environmental
Alright,
studies
this'll probably
and
be the
director of
last
the
one for
Stanford
today.
Woods Institute in California,
Nobody's here
told
anyways
us all
watching,
about.
so
And the
I don't
scientists
know, it's
kind of
pretty
act like
pointless.
detectives. They use a variety of techniques, like on CSI.
When was the last time you watched CSI?
Oh, I don't know. Is CSI even still on?
He's probably more into The Good Wife. And Chris has been studying the secrets of carbon dioxide for decades.
And so, how can we track what is carbon dioxide that's being farted out of trees and animals, and what is carbon dioxide that's coming from fossil fuels?
It's really pretty easy. And I need to do a little mini chemistry lesson to help make this clear. But
Wowee!
you can think about several flavors of carbon dioxide.
Chris basically tells us that there are different types of carbon out there. And this may sound surprising, but there's carbon that's not radioactive and carbon that is radioactive. Radioactive carbon disappears over a very, very long period of time. Now, anything on the Earth's surface with carbon in it has both kinds of carbon. It's got the radioactive kind and the non-radioactive kind. So, yes, you and me, we're all a little bit radioactive. And so are all the plants and the animals that you see around you. But there's something that doesn't have radioactive carbon in it, and that's fossil fuels. Why? Because fossil fuels are made of dead animals and plants that have been buried for millions of years. And during that time, all of the radioactive carbon inside of them slowly disappears. After millions of years, it's gone completely. So, when we burn oil and gas and coal today, they don't have any radioactive carbon left in them. Just that other kind of carbon. So when scientists like Ralph measure samples of air, they find lots of carbon that doesn't have any radioactivity, meaning it's carbon that's been smushed beneath the Earth's surface for millions of years.
Of the human-released CO2, because it doesn't have any of this radioactivity. When Keeling started his measurements, we could tell really, really clearly, and we'd see the signal.
And that's how scientists know whether carbon in the air is from burning fossil fuels or from the planet breathing.
And that signal is really very, very clear.
Using these measurements and other studies, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, announced in 2014 that there was enough evidence to say that it was extremely likely that the burning of fossil fuels was the main cause of climate change in the mid-20th century. And by the way, they also wrote that it's not just carbon dioxide causing all this trouble. There are other greenhouse gases, such as methane, which partly comes from cows belching, and nitrous oxides, as well as water vapor. And Chris says that if there was a big problem with this conclusion, at this point, we would know, because scientists have been trying to poke holes in it for years.
So every scientist out there is banging on this infrastructure of knowledge as hard as he or she can to find what's wrong with it. And nobody's found a flaw. Everybody fine-tunes, but everybody's trying to find that big flaw that would make him or her famous.
So, this is why 97% or more of climate scientists agree that warming trends are caused by human activities. But just because most of science can agree on that point doesn't mean the experts have it all figured out. Because there's still a lot of disagreement about what comes next. What will all of this warming
See you tomorrow.
mean for our future? And this disagreement is happening right up close, right at